So I'm going to do things a little differently this week if I can.
When I do these things, I remind myself that it's not a performance. I'm here to be genuinely with my folks and stuff. So being genuine isn't of particularly and peculiarly high priority for me for some reason, though it appears to be that's not the optimal strategy. but
I'm not going to complain. That's the way I am. So
that's the way to be, I think.
What you see is what you get.
So last time I I had Dr. Allan Bomhard on, and I didn't record your mic. That was not intentional. It was not like just what does Brian say.
Nothing worth saying. You're only going to hear me.
Since that 1 week, the world has gotten to be a lot crazier.
While we were sitting here last week, insurgents were storming the United States Capitol.
Yeah, that was going on. And
I went home and I turned on the television. I couldn't believe it.
I have a perspective on this. I don't know. Well, I don't consider it to be a right perspective. So when looking at things where there seems to be two sides, it is very alluring to pick a side and to try and reinforce that in a struggle. And the reason why that's not helpful and why that's sort of an escalating behavior or a behavior that leads to escalation is because identity is more born through opposition than it is through agreement. It's very rare to find somebody who is deliberate enough in their worldview to have an identity based off agreement. I think you're one of them. You're more of an agreeable type person, and I think you have an ability to discern what to support based off of love. Most people aren't motivated that way. Most people are motivated through our brainstem, through the deep survival instinct. What do you oppose? Where's the danger? How to react from there? That's how most people view themselves. So even though it's really alluring to say, these insurgents, we're storming the Capitol, it's important to pick out, nevertheless, what particularly was reprehensible, what wasn't, and what was laudable, and what's comparable to other things. So during the Capitol, we saw, I think, 2 or 3 people died. One was a police officer, which was bludgeoned to death brutally with the fire extinguisher.
That's correct.
After getting hit with an American flag. A second one was a Air Force veteran woman who was shot in the neck by a police officer while protesting her government in person. And the third person was a woman who was trampled to death while holding a Gadsden flag, the Don't Tread on Me flag. It's a lot to unpack there. So, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is, while I don't necessarily agree with their message, of, for, and by the people. People do have the right to protest their government in person, possibly with violence. I mean, our founding fathers wrote vehemently about violence and its role in protest, particularly towards the government. And I do believe that people have the right to do that. I don't by any means condone any kind of violence towards each other that's not helpful. It's the logistical cost. You can say that violence and the loss of life even is the logistical cost of exercising freedoms. And there's a mature argument to make for saying, like, look, there's going to be some of that, even if you have a good message. I try to keep myself from having a firm opinion in support or in or otherwise for those kinds of people. I sympathize with them. I think that for a lot of cases, particularly Donald Trump, mustered up a movement of people that was more than Donald Trump, had to deal with feelings of nationalism, sometimes justified, sometimes not. And he made that movement mostly about him. And then immediately after it became clear that that protest was going to be smeared or thrown under the bus, Donald Trump, being an egotist, threw it on the bus. So I don't, there's a lot to unpack. I don't know, that's just my opinion. How do you see it?
How do I see it?
Yeah.
We still have the means in this country to make changes to our government institutions through the ballot box and legitimate ways or legal ways.
Mm-hmm.
Resorting to that kind of activity, putting in jeopardy the lives of every single member of Congress, putting in jeopardy the Capitol Police who are there to protect the lives of the members of Congress, putting in jeopardy the lives of all of the staff members,
Mm-hmm.
is not the way to proceed. If those means of rectifying wrongs, of making changes to our institutions are not available, then perhaps violence is the only means. I cannot, in good conscience, justify the activities of those who participated in the storming of the Capitol last Wednesday.
I don't either.
Peaceful protest, absolutely, absolutely. Expressing one's opinion, even getting angry, absolutely. No problem with that. Putting people in danger, and now COVID-19 is spreading among those who were forced into close quarters with others who were not wearing masks, and so on and so forth. There are repercussions, unintentional perhaps, but still repercussions for the actions that were taken.
Okay.
And people are, rightfully so in my opinion, being held accountable by law enforcement through legal means, being arrested, being charged with sedition, with violence, with destroying property.
Sure.
All of these are offenses for anybody.
Right. That's, that's fair. So you brought up a point initially about when you have legal channels available to you, use them. And peaceful channels available
There was
to
an
you.
election that was held.
Right.
A person won that election.
Do you, well, I get what you and I believe, but do you believe that they thought that they had those legal channels available to them?
It doesn't matter what they think, because those legal channels are available to them. Because a person is delusional is no excuse. One doesn't go into a court of law and
It isn't an excuse, but it is an explanation. So
it's an explanation, and they're still being held accountable.
right.
Likewise, in most legal cases where an insanity plea is registered, it's thrown out.
Right. I understand. I'm well aware of the legal proceedings and what it is de facto in terms of law. The third point that I brought up between the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the third point was the comparison. So a lot of people compare this to the BLM protests, and we see an asymmetry in how that's represented in power. Those two are very similar in a lot of core aspects, though politically from other sides of a fence. We saw, for both of them, we saw selection of a minority of those actions as presented as representative of the entirety of that message, and that's not fair. We saw that with BLM, where millions of people partook in that.
And there was a minority who were looting.
Yeah,
And
I don't even think they were protesting. I think those were looters who took advantage
that
of.
is, I agree with you.
Right.
Absolutely.
And the fact that the looting happened was used as a cover-up, more or less, to arrest organizers, which we saw in Seattle. So we did see the rest of organizers. I don't know if those organizers were charged with sedition.
In Portland.
Probably
yes.
a lot of them, right?
Yes.
So I agree with. I wouldn't say agree, but I understand the sentiments of both of those things, right? So the sentiment on the left from BLM is police brutality towards minorities. There is police brutality that occurs towards minorities. The appropriate amount is 0, but is it disproportional? Is it de facto something that's it? Is the fact that we're so upset over this representative of reality, or is that representative of our feelings? And de facto, it's representative of our feelings, right? There's
That's correct.
Statistically, and if you look at the numbers, and if you divorce yourself from your feelings, you can look at these things and determine that that's an emotional outcry.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, on the Trump rally, on the Trump riots, protests, they believe that an election was stolen from them. Now, legally, de facto, you can go through and say, no, actually, while there is fraud present in every election, you can pick out those instances of fraud and say, this is representative of the whole election. That doesn't fly. That's unfair for them to do that.
The instances of fraud were infinitesimally
Right.
small.
I wouldn't say
even the
infinitesimally.
Attorney General, who was a Trump supporter, Bill Barr,
Right.
said so.
On terms of a national election, I would agree. There are instances of fraud on smaller more local levels, flipping counties and flipping elections. And also more instances of blunders and miscalculations, flaws in the election process that do flip results on smaller levels. So I don't think that, just like with police brutality, police brutality always being a problem, I do believe that fraud and election meddling is an issue. The appropriate amount is 0, but is it enough to justify the emotional outcry? No, it's absolutely not.
No.
That's not in line with reality. However, there is a thread that we can take away from that. Unquestionably, this is a consolidation of power from people. I would be very surprised if the people like Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell get any attention thrown to them or directed at them from this point on. I don't think they will. I think that
Epstein's dead.
Epstein is dead, right? But I don't think that conspiracy of what the elite do in this country in their consumption of people, I don't think that's going to have any light shed on it. I think that right now the elite are more represented than the people, and I see that the Trump administration is more like a power struggle between one megalomaniac and the rest of the megalomaniac sociopaths. That's how I see the Trump admin. I don't necessarily see it as like a people's revolution, though people want it to be that way. People on the right or the everyday average working man, there's plenty of those who want it to be that, and it is not that.
It is not that. I agree with you.
The Trump movement is about Trump, and it co-opts the ideas of nationalism or these ideas and these legitimate concerns. Like the average working man is concerned that there's not going to be the same opportunity afforded to his children than he had. He's going to have to deal with the fact that internationalization in particular has put America into a position by design from World War II forward off of Bretton Woods. We've designed this position we're in, and that's been carried through multiple generations to a point where we have bled out a lot of the opportunity that's afforded to the common person. My generation, the millennial generation, likely won't own property to any significant extent. We'll probably live more like serfs. By the time I'm your age, our political system and our social system will look a lot more like feudalism. That's the only way. If you take postmodernism, which is there is no truth, only power, and you bring that to its logical, ideological conclusion. You get serfdom. You get some form of feudalism. This is the same as the feudalist ideologies at the time, that might makes right. Remember, no truth, only power. Might makes right. Feudalism, serfdom, those things go hand in hand. So we're seeing a revolution of that ideologically, slowly, incrementally. And that is concerning. We have this very tiny window in history where we might have enough, if we had a concerted effort to really clean house and say, no, we the people of the United States of America, we're going to make sure that the United States is no longer geopolitically in a position that compromises us, the average citizen, because it is. And unequivocally, this election cycle has moved us back towards, get ready because it's going to be the same business as usual. That's how it's gone. That's true. You can and should protest that. Is that a point that's too nuanced to make to every individual?
Absolutely.
Yes, way too. It's way too
absolutely. Thinking while you're speaking that the average person, the average, let's say, Trump supporter,
right,
has no concept of the ideas that you're expressing.
Large groups of people, of regular people, well, no, large groups of any people have to communicate through sound bites, right? So you don't...
Sound bite slogans.
Yeah, tiny little...
Yeah.
The packet size of the information
Absolutely.
has to go down in order to distribute it across a network. That's just how it goes. It's a fundamental law of information theory. Packet size has to decrease as the network size increases. Yeah, so I believe that's correct. Like this fighting globalism, these deep sentiments these people have, they don't articulate very well, that don't translate, because they can't articulate them, it doesn't translate well into policy. So they make these blunders and they do all these kinds of things. And sometimes ugliness comes out because, emotional outlashes are the language of people who can't express through language. That's why, like, when dealing with toddlers, the very first thing to teach them is feeling words. Mm-hmm. Tell me you're angry, these sorts of things. Because if they can't say them, they'll act them. So, yeah, no, I think that's correct from an American policy standpoint. That sentiment, that deep sentiment that those Trump supporters have, that's right. If they want to leave more opportunity to their progeny in this country, then they have to do that. You do have to be, quote unquote, tough on China. I hate that term, but it's true. The Chinese Communist Party is an organized conspiratorial effort to systematically gain power in the United States.
We gave China everything on a silver platter.
By design. Thank Henry Kissinger and particularly Richard Nixon.
American business.
Yeah.
Moved factories, moved technology to China at the expense of the American worker.
Yeah. That's
and moved to other manufacturing places besides China.
Well, I want to take a look. Yeah.
To target China and ignore the Americans who participated in making China's economy the second strongest in the world.
No, China's economy is by far and away ahead of the United States'. We measure economy in terms of GDP and not gross national output.
However you want to look at it. The problem is, and you identified it earlier when you were talking about your generation and what it's going to face, feudalism. It's Americans, American businesses.
Right. Well, particularly American elite.
Who have their own self-interest.
Oh yeah, it's that is absolutely by design.
Of course it is.
Yes. Let's this economic migration of capital and control from the U.S. to abroad.
Okay.
Let's examine that. And I don't want to pick just on China because there's dozens of countries where stuff leads to. So there's actually 3 generations of time that we're talking about. Soon to be a 4th generation of time that we're talking about when we want to look at that migration. It starts with World War II. It starts with the end of World War II, where the United States was concerned about the spread of the Soviets. So basically, we decided we were going to bribe up an alliance with West Europe. And correct me if I'm getting this story wrong. That culminated into an agreement called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And the Bretton Woods Agreement was an effort to rebuild Europe, where the United States would remove its tariffs, would open its markets, and open its capital, will loan capital to nations like Finland and Great Britain to rebuild, reindustrialize, and sell their product primarily to the United States. And better yet, we would be the first lender, the first consumer, and they would reindustrialize and grow their country. And the other benefit to it is that anyone under the security umbrella of the West could trade with each other without having to maintain a navy. We all pitched in to NATO. Mm-hmm. Beautiful thing. Worked like the Dickens. We rebuilt Western Europe. Western Europe was fantastically wealthy compared to its Eastern counterparts. We did a much better job at that than the Soviets. And more or less, the Cold War kicked off without a kickoff. We didn't. Nothing happened. We just weighed the Soviets out. They ran into Hayek's calculation problem, like he had laid out, pretty straightforward. And the Soviet Empire collapsed, and we got left holding the bag. That was the end of the first generation. That's when Keynes and the architects of this died. Keynes, by the way, had a quote where he said, "In the long run, well, we're all dead." Well, Keynes has been dead for 2 generations now, and we're reaping what he's sown. So, second generation comes around. This is the era of Henry Kissinger, George H.W. Bush, Milton Friedman. Mm-hmm. They saw the opportunity of having this security umbrella that worked in this common marketplace within that, and saw the opportunity to extend that globally. As the world had proliferated thousands and thousands of nuclear warheads, extending that globally is a great way to hedge against the possibility of industrialized nations going to war with one another. And neoliberal ideology, Milton Friedman stuff, it makes a lot of sense. We've pulled billions of people out of poverty because of that capital flight from the United States to go industrialize other places. We like to pick on sweatshops and stuff, but sweatshops and terrible working conditions, they're the beginnings of better working conditions. And people wouldn't go to those sweatshops if they weren't subsistence farmers before then. So while we like to look at ugly things and say, the ugly thing is ugly, may be true, but it's also sometimes a necessary ugliness. We've just by virtue of China industrializing, about 1.5 billion people, not China's 1.5 billion, but about 1.5 billion people have come out of the poverty line and not stopped at above the poverty line, but moved into the global middle class. These are people making the equivalent of like $10,000, $15,000 a year, which is very good for anyone globally. Neoliberalism has done very good. Unfortunately, we're coming into the third era, the third generation. These people, like Henry Kissinger, he's still alive, but he's retired. Milton Friedman's dead. Mm-hmm. H.W. Bush is gone. That second generation has died off. We're determining what the third generation is going to do. The issue with this globalization is that it's not sustainable for the United States. We cannot continue to patrol the global waters, be the policeman of the world with a $500+ billion military budget, domestic military budget, so that we can pick up the bill for the rest of the world to make sure that they don't. The default state is regional powers compete for trade routes, and they compete via war. That's where the era of geopolitics, where nations could formally declare war. That's what they would do it over, is trade routes. It was a formal declaration, like England would be at war with France. There you go. Now it has to be done through proxies, and it's a little bit more nuanced and entangled than that. But the default state is this: regional powers competing for resources and those trade routes. We no longer have that. Nations like South Korea can exist and do extraordinarily well because they don't have to maintain really much of a navy or anything like that. They get to trade with the entire world. There's a dollar standard. All these things that allow for global trade and integration are wonderful, but they come at the net expense of the United States. The United States does not use the common market. 1% of our GDP is exports. We don't care. Of that 1%, maybe it's 3%. I think 1% is global exports. 3% is net exports, but most of that goes to the US, to Canada and Mexico.
Right.
We don't care. Our economy is not vested in making sure that there's markets for our goods somewhere else. Other countries like Germany, South Korea, China, the Philippines, those countries are very invested in the fact that there's a common marketplace, because they could not maintain the level of prosperity that they've seen without global cooperation. So let's talk about the state of global cooperation. There's a bad actor, an organized bad actor in the spirit of global cooperation. It's the CCP. I don't feel like I need to go off berating the CCP. There are virtues that they have. They're strong, but they're totalitarian. It's one-party rule. They have a dictator. They have concentration camps. They harvest and sell human organs. They do a lot of really nasty stuff because their power is not checked. Because, as you said, the world has handed them prosperity on a golden platter. And this is a communist regime.
No argument.
We have a history, a global history with communist regimes. We know what they do. China isn't just a communist regime. It's a communist regime where all of the people who are in politics are not politicians, they're engineers. These are people who know how to do back of the envelope calculations, which is like a breakthrough for all communists. Like the Chinese are very, very smart, cunning people. They know how, they've observed history, a lot of nasty stuff. They have 100 years of modern history of learning what the rest of the world will do to them. They know what the Opium War is. They've been through the Opium War. Why do you think there's fentanyl, Chinese fentanyl, on the streets of the US? Because they had that experience with it. They know what colonialism is. That's why they have One Belt, One Road. They know how to subvert weaknesses. They're not dumb. These are the people who wrote Art of War. So they are in a position to where one-party totalitarian rule can more or less go unchecked and co-opt dozens of governments, about 100 governments around the world. They'll be able to co-opt, and particularly the democratic ones. Democracy, they have a very good strategy for dealing with democracies. Look at what they did with Australia, what they're doing with Germany, what they're doing with the Western Europe. The CCP is having undue amounts of influence and power siphoned to it. And that's not sustainable. The United States is in a position of that siphon that you alluded to, where American corporations take capital, technology, know-how, everything, and move it abroad to then resell to the Americans. That creates vast inequality in the American system, intolerable amounts of inequality. Mm-hmm. Look, every American corporation has the business model of extract resources from the third world, ship it to the developing world, manufacture it into finished products, and then import it into the developed world. Developing world to the developed world, like the United States or Western Europe, where it's consumed. The idea of the Western citizen, as viewed from the corporation, the ideal citizen is just an indebted consumer who has no power and no say in what their government does. Because if they did have power and say in what the government does, they would change that arrangement. Because of inequality, because of national security, because of opportunity to their children, for every reason, both right and left. So yes, the elite in the country need to maintain this unsustainable arrangement that we have laid out for ourselves. And in the Trump movement, at least economically, they were right on about this globalist stuff. This has to be put into check. We need to put up tariffs. We need to get out of this. We need to not be the world's reserve currency anymore. We don't want, whatever percentage it is. It's like the majority of all the US dollars are being traded outside the US. The majority of our omnibus spending bill, if I'm not mistaken, about $700 billion of it just went right out the country for all kinds of crazy stuff. Pakistani gender studies, kickback money, political kickback money. We just saw that. It's blatant. That's on the writing is on the wall. So yeah, that needs to be corrected. Domestically, we can't allow this. Jeff Bezos is the second richest person in the world, and his whole business is he is the pipeline of capital that's moved abroad to the consumer market. Mm-hmm. indebted consumer. We don't want to live that way. It's not good for our spirit. It's not good for our industry. It's not good for our environment, because American industry is relatively clean compared to global industry where there are no regulations. One of the reasons why we have so many stifling environmental regulations in the United States is because there's none abroad. And that gives advantage to people who have access to moving abroad. So yeah, that siphon is something we have to stop. The problem with doing that is that the virtues of the second generation of globalization, the Milton Friedman type people, those still stand. Because they said, hey, look, industrialized countries, they're not going to go to war with one another. Well, if we're wrong in correcting what's unsustainable about globalization, then you could potentially see industrialized nations go to war. And there's no coming back from that because there's nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. So this is the problem that's one of the problems from which I try to build my worldview. It's clear that unsustainable arrangement is systemically dangerous from multiple angles to the survival of our entire species and the well-being of the global population. It's absolutely clear. If we do nothing and we keep the siphon going, then we get ready for totalitarian rule, because the CCP is going to take over the rest of the world in a way that it shouldn't have been able to unless we actively enabled it to do so. That's if we do nothing. If we do decide to do something and we're clumsy about it, then get ready for nuclear war, because that's what will happen. Because without these trade gates going, keeping war expensive, war will happen. And you don't want to see what the kind of weapons that we've been able to develop. You don't want to see a world where they get unleashed. So there's this very narrow sliver of possibilities where we do correct ourselves. It's very narrow. And the kind of people who are in the positions to make the decisions that can get us through that, like, eye of the needle that we have to go through in history, the kind of people are there simply because they're social climbers. Like we mentioned, we talked about last time, how there are these slots, the first and second order failures of human emulation, how monkey see, monkey do. We assess our situation, we assess someone else, decide whether we want to emulate them based on what they have, and then on the assumption that if we do what they do, we'll have what they have. The first failure is people who are right but are in undesirable social situations, we ignore. So you might be profoundly right about something, but if you're, I don't know, some loser, no one's going to listen to you. You have to have some kind of clout for people to listen to you. The other one is, we also will listen to falsehoods if it's from the right perspective.
And if they are in agreement with our preconceived ideas, even a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Confirmation biases. Yeah.
Confirmation bias, yes.
Yeah. So I it's not that I've given up hope on the future, and someday, like today, even though today in our country, millions of Americans will go to work, and they're all going to accomplish something today. So today is going to be better for that reason than yesterday was. I do see systemic threat on the horizon for us. I see a very small sliver of hope, and it's important that it's important for our species and our survival that we deal with that we get that extreme unlikeliness to occur. We've already been through a couple of these like eye of the needle situations in history. Like the Cuban Missile Crisis was one, where it was much more likely than not that nuclear warheads were going to fly within a 24-hour window. Mm-hmm. That's one. There's a couple of, by the way, we owe our lives to one Soviet, I think he was like a lieutenant or something. You might know this story better than I do. But he vetoed decisions. It was 2 against 3. They needed to be unanimous. He said, no, we're not going to launch our nuclear weapons. The World War III has not broken out. That guy saved humanity by his stubbornness. Mm-hmm. Saint. He should be sainted. But, yeah, just geopolitically, I find it more likely that we'll do nothing and that it'll be the rule of the CCP. I'm not trying to say like, the CCP will rule and we're all going to be miserable. That's maybe true. Some people will be miserable. Some people will be part of the CCP. But the main reason why I would critique that is because you are consolidating a lot of power. You're putting all of your eggs into one basket that is proven to be very unstable. Communist regimes collapse once they reach their growth limit. Well, not their growth limit. Their growth limit is actually how much capital can they siphon off and steal from other things. They don't they run the Hayek's calculation problem.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that's the communism part of communism with Chinese characteristics. The other part is the Chinese characteristics. China has pretty much always been the global superpower, but it can't stay together. There are multiple ethnic groups. The Han Chinese try to dominate the other ones. But China has only been together as a nation for about 300 some odd years over the last couple thousand. It doesn't stay together very long because it consolidates so much power. And power, when you have one gun in the room and everyone's scrambling for that gun to enforce their ideas, to enforce their vision of the world, understandably that's quite unstable, right? That's what it happens when you create powerful governments, when you have that situation. So the future where we don't do anything and the CCP gains, dominance in the world is a future where, one, while it's successful, the majority of the citizens will be quite miserable under totalitarian rule. And two, it won't be successful for long because it'll probably collapse. And then you're going to be into the regional power scramble for stability and survival thing with nuclear weapons thrown in there. So I just don't see a good future for people that are my age because our children will have it worse off than us.
Now, historically,
Mm-hmm.
when you look at the history of China, China has never been outward looking. It's always been inward looking. And yes, it's been unstable throughout most of its history. Perhaps one of the most stable regimes was the Qing dynasty, the
Mm-hmm.
last dynasty. Kept things together, as you said, for about 300 years. They just didn't care about anybody else. They just didn't matter. China was the pinnacle, from their point of view, the celestial kingdom. That was it. The rest of the world was irrelevant.
When the British finally came to China, the emperor greeted them in Latin. That was the last time they cared.
There was a great emperor in the 1700s when China was the most powerful, richest nation in the world.
So you're saying that...
And yes, they brought him... They had a court debate about religion, for example, and the Buddhists, and they had Franciscans, I believe it was Franciscans there. And they were aware of the rest of the world. They were engaged with the rest of the world in a very limited manner. And the result of that debate, that the emperor listened to various sides and declared Christianity to be insane and had the Franciscan monk locked up.
They might be right.
In any case, they were aware, they were engaged, but they were not focused on spreading their power beyond a certain perimeter.
Right.
Even during the Qing dynasty, their rule in Outer Mongolia, in what's now Xinjiang province, and in Xizang in Tibet, was weak.
It still is.
No,
No?
no, absolutely not. They
thought
rule
they
it
were
with
having-
an iron fist.
I thought they were having strong border disputes with India.
That's internally.
Okay.
China is a dictatorship.
Okay.
all parts of China. The so-called national minorities are ruled with an iron fist. Look at what's happening now to the Muslim majority,
The Uyghur population.
the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province.
Oh, yeah, and the people who practice following...
Xinjiang autonomous region.
Yeah, autonomous region.
Well, they're not. They are ruled very, very strictly.
Right.
And religion is used as a means to control the population, at the same time being suppressed.
I can't help but think we, from our outside perspectives, see things more plainly. And someone from the inside in China would be able to point out that there are many nuances. They probably they definitely experience politics in the Chinese party more nuanced than we do. And similarly, the rest of the world likely sees our politics plainly. And we see it with greater nuance. I'm not trying to excuse, I don't think I'm wrong. I don't think you're wrong. I don't think anyone from the outside is wrong about what they observe about China. Mm-hmm. As long as they're intelligent. Some people just say, stupid things, but that's because they're just not educated on it. I am concerned about it. So
I speak Chinese. 我说中文，我有很多中国的朋友. I speak Chinese. I have a lot of Chinese friends.
Okay.
I know the attitude of ethnic Chinese. They think the national minorities should be suppressed.
Right. That's
if they're not Chinese.
That's kind of a problem.
Even though they live within the borders of the People's Republic of China, they are subhuman.
That's a
and
problem.
These are ordinary people. These are not some of them Western educated.
Right. That's a problem.
It is a big problem.
One of the reasons why I brought up the seeing each other from afar is in the United States, we tend to think of ourselves as the good guys because up until now, we've been winning. You can, with good reason, interpret the United States as a very nasty, fascistic, bullying place. The United States...
Have you read any of the works of Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States?
I haven't.
Our history is awful. The things we have done throughout our history, regardless of how we see ourselves. In that regard, we are no better nor any worse than any other nation.
That's why I was going to ask you. Because I guess this is my anarcho-libertarian speaking, but you can define a government as an organized crime syndicate that has a monopoly over a geographical area. If taxes are indeed theft, and theft is just someone taking from you without your consent, and whether you consent or not to taxes is irrelevant, you have to pay them. Then you can look at a government as like this really nasty entity. So it wouldn't be at all surprising that probably every government has a lot of skeletons in their closet. And just to list some of them in the United States, this is a nation founded on genocide before we even got here with germ warfare. We don't know how many millions. Probably, my guesstimate is about 120 million Native Americans died to smallpox and Western flu. Well, flu's kind of a generalized term, but there's a lot of sicknesses that killed a very high proportion of Native Americans. The white man's firewater, alcohol. In North America, for most of North America, you can't go 100 meters without running into fresh water on the surface. That's why, and potable fresh water. That's why Native Americans did not have an adaptation to alcohol the way Europeans did, because the Europeans lived close to animals. We did animal husbandry very close. We lived literally with pigs and chickens and cows in European winters, so you were very intimately close to them all the time. The water was filthy all the time. So we had to sterilize it with alcohol in order to not die. That was not the case in North America. The more I learn about Native American societies, the more I admire them. Though I do recognize that there's, of course, horrors that took place, and the Native, I don't romanticize them. But I believe, I value freedom. I think that the freest peoples, the freest humans ever to live would probably be either like a Mongolian teenage boy or like a Comanche teenage boy. Native Americans did not live, Northern Native Americans, the Central Americans did live with an organized state and government. But Northern Native Americans lived in a stateless society, in what we would consider to be an anarchy. Oh, yeah.
No, there were huge cities here around St. Louis, Georgia.
Yes, the mounds. Right.
The mounds.
But I'm talking about...
You're thinking about the Plains Indians or...
Yes, them. There's also the Seminole tribe. A lot of them didn't do that. They were mostly nomadic.
Okay.
They were nomadic and horticultural. So they did plant, they did do agriculture in a way, but it wasn't fixed agriculture. They would walk around, they would nomadically roam while planting seeds. Yeah, but very horticultural. Like a lot of food crops were unique to the Americas. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did excellent agriculture actually while being hunter gatherers. But yeah, I see them as examples of knowing what human freedom is much better than their Western counterparts. Well, we say Western, but it's really to the east of them, of course. But they knew what freedom was much better than we did. Like we had issues. You didn't have a lot of Native Americans like leaving their tribes to come live amongst the white man. It was the other way around. We had issues where repressed people in European society would see the freedoms that they lived with and go join them. Sometimes whole colonies, likely the Roanoke colonies, Croatan. Like that's probably what happened. They just stopped and went off. But yeah, we start off by murdering those people with germ warfare and sometimes kinetic warfare. That's how the United States began before it was even a country. And then from there, we did other atrocities. We're the only country to ever deploy nuclear bombs on civilians. We put Japanese in internment camps. We did the Trail of Tears. We have overthrown governments for the sake of cheaper bananas. We annexed Hawaii so that Dole Foods could have pineapples. All sorts of wonderful, enlightening events are littered throughout U.S. history, and they get taken up by the highest levels of government. These are things that our elected officials do. So our democracy is clearly producing people who will do evil on a large scale, systematic evil on a large scale. So as much as I like the way the U.S. government is designed, and I think it's probably designed as well as you can design a republic, there are very few things I could think to change, and probably a lot of them that I would change I would do wrongly. So I don't know. It seems to be that like instability is unsurprisingly baked into history. Like that's just how it's going to go. Things don't last.
As I said the last time, we're not a nice species.
That's true. I mean, what would you change? What would you change about how the world goes? If I handed you like a magic brush and said, "Hey, paint the history," how would it go for you?
I don't have a clue.
It's probably the most mature answer.
I don't, and I've thought about it.
Yeah.
Each solution has its drawbacks.
Yeah. I mean, I would. There are things that I would change. I do think that your answer is the most moral. I do believe that the most moral thing to do if someone handed you power is to say, yes, thank you, great. Destroy it. if you can, if you're given the one ring, you throw it into Mount Dew. That would have been the beginning and the end of the story. I think that's the right thing to do, because I do think that flirting with power and using power and expecting good to come out of it is a fool's game. It's like going to a casino and expecting to win money. It's just not in the nature of power to do that. You can incidentally do good with power for sure, but at the cost, net cost of evil elsewhere, right? I might be able to feed the hungry, but I have to feed the hungry with funds that I stole from the productive. Mm-hmm. And if it
not necessarily the productive, but the people who have money.
That's a good correction. I would argue that the people who have money who aren't productive, you'll never get anyway. It's a fool's errand to try to go and get money from people who don't produce, who just steal.
And I see no problem with that, as long as they are cared for and not caused any physical or bodily harm.
The non-producing people
do not need, no one person needs $80 billion. Nobody.
I agree with you.
Regardless of whether they have access to it or it's all liquid or not, and it never is.
Stock prices, yeah.
No one person needs $1 billion.
I agree with you on people's needs and practicality in their lifestyle. I would agree with no one lifestyle needs that much or can utilize that much. I think that if you're trying to do something like put rockets on Mars,
yes,
you're going to need $80 billion.
But that's a corporate thing.
It is, right.
And yes, you found a company if you're Musk.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen the opulent mansions that were built in the Gilded Age?
Yeah, they're all overgrown with vines now because no one can sustain them.
Or their museums or
the Vanderbilt Institute.
Yeah. Right. In any case, that's still going on.
Oh, yeah. And tacky. Really tacky wealth, too. It's like the kleptocrats. Like, at least in the Gilded Age, the people who were we call them robber barons, but they really knew their craft, right? At least Rockefeller knew how an oil rig worked. And if you had put him on an oil rig, he would be able to do physical work. That was the extent that Rockefeller knew his trade. The guys that are around today, what they do is a black box to them. The corporate CEOs don't really I don't believe the guy who's the corporate CEO at Walmart would know how to use a cashier's register. He probably doesn't have that knowledge. He probably doesn't know how to stock the shelf.
You see that quite clearly on Undercover Boss.
Oh, yeah. You do see the gross incompetence of what the business actually does by the highest. And we also see this. Yeah. We also see this by our elected leaders. Like, these are people who don't know how to pay their own taxes, but require it from everyone else, and they don't know how to start. They're just largely incompetent. At least in the golden, I wouldn't say golden. It is gilded, right? It's only a surface thing. At least those people knew what they were talking about. Largely, I mean, Vanderbilt was a transportation tycoon. He knew transportation. Right? Yeah. To some extent, we no longer have that. And there were multiple.
Perhaps one exception.
What was that?
Warren Buffett.
Buffett knows his stuff.
Buffett knows his stuff. Have you ever seen how he lives?
Yeah, very meekly.
Very, very
plainly.
Meekly, plainly.
Yeah. Well, he does have a private jet. He doesn't deny himself anything, as he says. But he gets everything he wants. I think Musk is somewhat the same way. I don't know what Musk's living arrangement is now. But he seems to be, as far as I can tell, a good person. I see a lot of problems with Musk. Largely the fact that guy's not going to live forever, and he's going to open technological gates to new frontiers that will be probably wonderful at first, but very briefly, and then turn into a technological hell. I see Musk as opening the door to hell. Like that Skynet project he has. They call it what do they call the global internet? I just keep on thinking of it as Skynet because it's what it is. Starlink, right? So
yes,
this is global penetrating, high bandwidth, low latency, satellite-based radio. Not radio, it's satellite-based internet. That and Neuralink scare the hell out of me. Like, imagine the penetration that technology is going to have when it's jacked into your physiology and you can't really turn it off. Like, you won't have to deal with it. I'll have to deal with it.
I've often thought that.
Yeah.
I'm glad I am my age. No, seriously. The future that I see and that you have so aptly described is just not to my liking, not to my taste.
Yeah.
And I pity your generation and younger.
It's exciting, but it's also very scary. Like, look at what the internet has done in terms of media. We now see the consolidation of power with tech media. I don't say media or technology. That's the same entity at this point. Tech media is one entity. So I see tech media as sort of an aberration of how media used to be. So when you look at the 1950s and the golden age of mass media production, it was just that. It was mass media production. So you had to have Walter Cronkite. You had to have people who were centrist at the helm of your broadcasts because you didn't know who was listening. You had to be sort of the average of your entire audience, not to offend or upset people. So it was much more cohesive then. The problem is that now media gets to know you on a level that is very unsettling. It knows so much non-intuitive stuff about you, and it knows whether you are predisposed to asthma. It knows certain biological things. It knows Facebook knows when you go to the bathroom. Google tries to know what you're going to buy next. They know your political affiliations. They know what your political affiliations are going to be in the next so on and so forth years, or are likely to be. They know things about you that you and I couldn't tell about ourselves. And what that does is it allows for tech media to silo people into different compartments. So now the ability of tech media to go from selling products to selling audiences to advertisers. Now it's like Noam Chomsky's, it sells consent. So you know that our globalist situation here is untenable. This siphon keeps going. Well, I have a way of making sure you consent to that, and it's tech media. So look, they usurped Donald Trump, legitimately usurped Donald Trump through legal means, right? But I am far and away more concerned with organized and capable evil that you will not hear about than I am with some guy with freaky hair who is spray tanned orange, who's a bumbling fool. I don't think Trump is always a bumbling fool. I think he's a megalomaniac, but that's one monkey to deal with. I don't know what I have to deal with on the side of tech media. I have no idea. The people who write those algorithms, I don't know how organized they are. I don't know to what degree is it organic that this stuff gets done. I don't know how many conspiracies there are. You don't know. And that's what unsettles me so much, is that we will consent to evils that we won't even know we were signed up for. It just won't be reported. It won't be in our conscious awareness. I'll give you an example of one of my ignorances. When I read about how many people died in the Trump rallies, or the Trump protest and riot at the Capitol, I thought, yeah, no police died during the BLM riots, did they?
Not that I'm aware of.
There have been. I looked this up. There were 5 that died in Dallas. Just Dallas. Like, because I'm not aware of that because I wasn't made aware of that. Now, why wasn't I made aware of that? That's kind of how this whole thing works. Look, I mean, like, this scared the heck out of me. Check it out. Look for yourself. I mean, it might be fake news. Who knows? But I don't believe it is. It says Associated Press. So
Didn't know about it.
the extent of that research is me literally just using a search. How many police officers died in the BLM riots? And that's just Dallas.
News has always been like that. It's always been selective. And we've never had access to 100% information about what goes on. Something like this, seems to me like suppression.
Yeah, I would say so too. The question is it suppression by multiple layers? Is there really someone like sitting here like comparing news articles and saying, oh no, this one's not with the narrative? Or is it organic? Or is there an organic layer and then a conspiratorial layer? Are there designers of people's ideology? Are there people like literally sitting in rooms saying we need to get Americans to believe this or do that or be okay with this or consent to that?
Of course there are.
Okay.
There are. They're called think tanks.
Yeah, Rand Institute or Rand Corporation is one of them. These are people who are like, yeah, you did mention that. You didn't work for Rand, did you?
I did not.
Okay.
No, I worked for NSA.
Okay. I wanted to ask you more about that, by the way. That's intensely interesting. When did you work for the NSA?
When I was in the Army Security Agency, which no longer exists.
Okay.
And which I'm free to talk about now because 10 years have passed since I worked for them. Army Security Agency and there was a Naval Security Agency and so on and so forth. Each branch of the military had, and I don't know if they still do, I assume they still do, a group that reported directly to NSA and not through the regular chain of command. They were responsible, as was I, for covert data gathering by electronic means, just as NSA does today. And of course, when I was part of that, the technology was much more primitive than what we have now. Mm-hmm. And that information that we gathered was sent back to Washington, D.C. Comfortably recording all of this.
Oh, don't worry about it. Don't say anything that's going to get you in trouble. But
and it was going on. Now this is Brian. This is the '60s. It was going on then, and it's been going on since then, and it's become increasingly sophisticated.
So in the '60s, was there how sophisticated was it in comparison to what was publicly known to be publicly known to be possible then?
In my experience, we used the tools that were available.
Okay, so it wasn't like
radios, listening,
right?
Radios, tape recorders.
Okay, so that would be an indication that
I can even remember some of what I listened in on.
Well, don't repeat it.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter now.
No. One in particular from the Cambodian police. Un avion a survolé notre territoire. Ah oui, fractured French. Altitude de so many meters venant de Thailand. Now, being a French linguist, would have to listen to it, transcribe it, translate it, and send it into Saigon.
What were they saying there?
That particular one, a plane, an avion, survolé notre territoire. A plane has circled our territory coming from Thailand and so on and so forth. And we'd monitor troop movement down the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail and the French rubber plantation owners who talked on walkie-talkies and passed all of their messages in French.
But on that level, there wasn't any vastly alien technology that was
There
available.
was no alien technology that I saw.
I don't mean to say alien like
I know
as
what you mean. Yeah,
but-
stuff that wasn't readily available to the public.
right.
No, we used stuff that was readily available.
Okay. Yeah, so that would be an indication that, unsurprisingly, at least at that deep of a layer into government affairs or military affairs, this isn't some fantastic thing that people tend to imagine. Like, oh, there have to be people with like mind wave, No,
Absolutely. No, but I did see the raw material that went in, and I saw the greatly edited and distorted stuff that came out, that was released.
Yeah. So being behind that curtain was pretty enlightening to how.
I went in to the service young, naive, and I came out very much opposed to the Vietnam War.
Most people who go through the armed service end up being libertarians, just by the sheer amount of waste and just they don't want to be involved with it.
Yeah, I'm still in contact with many of the guys who were in my unit in Vietnam.
No.
Only one of whom continued on in espionage.
Espionage. So public or private?
Working for the government.
Okay. So only one of your group of people continued with that.
That I'm aware of, yes.
And
yeah. He's retired now.
How did it affect the rest of them? If you became more or less against the Vietnam War based off of what you saw, did the other people come to the same conclusion, or did they stay?
Many of the men who were in my unit are pro-military,
Okay.
are much more right-wing than I am. A few of us did not choose that direction.
Okay. So that might be a little bit more. Yeah, that's not like a very clear-cut operation thing where it's like, hey, people who come in definitely switch their minds.
No, I think it depends upon a lot of things,
Right.
what our personal experiences are, and our predispositions. And
It's not as clear as people who work in meatpacking factories becoming vegetarians.
right.
A high degree of them just don't eat meat after that. So, and the ones that, by the way, still eat meat after working in like pork packing plants usually have other weird oddities with them. Not, I say oddities, but they're really like aberrations. Like they become very abusive to their partners.
The one who is closest to me lives in Savannah.
Okay.
Geographically closest. The one who was emotionally closest,
Mm-hmm.
who I've kept in contact with all these years, lives in Ohio.
And what kind of person is the one who lives in Ohio?
He's very much the same belief system that I have.
Oh, okay.
And so does the one in Savannah, by the way.
Right. So
He turned out to be a lawyer, which surprised me when I found that out, when we resumed contact after many, many years, because he was very quiet, very soft-spoken.
Mm-hmm. Lawyers. Well, I guess like the majority of what lawyers do is research. So that might lend itself pretty well. Incidentally, So that would be an indication that there's one, the inner goings-ons of at least military intelligence is likely not alien to people. Two, the effects that it has is not a clear-cut operator, right? It doesn't like take people, they come in, they see how it goes on, and then they all believe one particular thing. It doesn't have a clear effect on them.
No, but the propaganda that comes out of that definitely distorts people's perception of what's really going on.
That's another thing that you reminded me to ask. Going into the Army and going into these things, it seems to me, I don't have firsthand experience, having not been in the armed forces, it seems to me that the training camps have a particular instilled ideology that they put into warriors. Most people that I've talked to that have been in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the wars in the Middle East, they have clear markers of a cookie cutter ideology, and it's specific to what would be necessary to make a warrior to go and do what they had to do up there. So it seems to me that there's a lot of psychological molding of people
absolutely.
going in.
People go through basic training, and you get taught to dress a certain way, think a certain way, eat a certain way. And if you don't, there's punishment.
So how much of that, like how prevalent was that going in? Like people had a particular ideological profile that they were more or less made to have in key areas going in, but then afterwards they fractured. So when you went into your service, were you made to believe a particular way? Did you know what you were supposed to think and believe?
No. I was young.
Okay.
I was naive. Very naive. This 1950s, for goodness sakes, and early 60s.
Okay.
I grew up under Eisenhower.
I like Ike Eisenhower. He's my favorite Republican and my favorite modern president.
But I learned a lot. I matured a little.
Hopefully not all the way. But that's fascinating. That you got to see kind of at least how it worked, or worked in the intel agency. And then I guess, what did you do after you came out of the Vietnam War?
I lived on the West Coast for a year because I was let out in San Francisco and Oakland, actually.
Oh.
And then I lived in New York for 12 years, and I worked for 33 years in IT, computing.
Right, a lot of linguists too. What was COBOL?
I was a COBOL programmer.
Okay.
1975 I began.
That would be the era. And then 75. So that would be the era where C started to overtake COBOL, right?
C, right. We didn't even have online. CICS was our first online thing. Everything, we hand-coded things. We punched our own
punch cards.
Hollerith cards, punch cards.
If you were really lucky, there was a mainframe and you had to rinse
We had
time.
JCL, job control language, that we had to punch.
Java is still around.
And we would gather up our cards. They had to be in a certain order. And we'd put rubber bands around them, and they'd take them over to a card reader that would then spit out our program on green bar paper, and then we'd have to desk check it and make corrections and run it to see if it
That's how things begin. And now we carry godlike technology in our pockets, where any curiosity...
Well, I remember our first hard drives. They had to wheel them. They were huge.
Pallet jacks.
Yeah.
24 megabytes. Wow. And now a $10 Raspberry Pi has like god-awful computing power. I mean...
And I remember, and this was not so long ago, I worked for Blue Cross in Massachusetts, and we were designing a claim database, a new claim database. And we were all in awe that the data stored was going to reach 1 terabyte.
The whole database had a terabyte. Terabyte is a nice little milestone. It's a nice milestone to go over. Nowadays, they're $100. I have a terabyte flash drive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, as cool as it is to look back and see where we are now, it's even scarier to think like at some point in the not so far future, people will be looking at like exabytes of data and like, terabyte bandwidths, or they could be, there's no telling, but it'll be like some tiny chip in your brain. We'll have to say, you had to use your thumbs and look at a screen. There were all these interface problems, and we had to use our words. Think about where, like, the vector that is like how technology has accelerated. There was some quote that I read where the problem with humanity is we have like ancient instincts and medieval institutions and godlike technology.
Yeah, it's true. When I was growing up, 1940s, we did not have a television.
Mm-hmm.
We did not have a car. We did not have a telephone. They came in about 1950 into my house. We had a little screen like that. There were 3 channels. We had an antenna on the roof. We had a party line. First car was a 1951 Chevrolet, and it was built like a tank.
Oh yeah, that is one thing. Yeah, the automotive industry. So there's pros and cons to modern design. One of the cons is planned obsolescence, and they hadn't quite figured that out. Uh-huh. Like Westinghouse appliances still run to this day.
Yeah,
because they didn't figure out like make that part out of plastic, so they have to buy another one. I hate planned obsolescence. That's one of the first watches that I ever bought was a mechanical watch made in the Soviet Union. Thing's a tank. You can't stop it. However, just like the Soviet Union's Pravda, it lies to you. Brother, you must get out of bed. It is already tomorrow. You are late for next week. Go now, now, now. That's why we named the watch Pravda, because like every like, and it was random. It is such a good like representation of the Soviet Union. First off, it'll never stop. Like it is a tank. It is not built to.
Milkmen used to deliver milk.
Yeah. The bottles.
Doctors used to come to the house, make house calls. Our televisions lasted for years. People would come and repair them.
Yeah, well, you can still repair TVs. It's a little bit different.
Yeah, I had a Sony. It was a 42 inch. It was a 42-inch flat panel display. Mm-hmm. After a year, it crapped out. I took it to Best Buy.
You should have. You should have asked.
I went to Best Buy. Uh-huh. I paid about $1,000 for it. They wanted more to repair it than I had paid for it.
It likely there's a good likelihood that a few electrolytic capacitors on the power supply board, the hot side of the power supply board, went out. Other than that, if you're actually getting a picture, sometimes with flat panel TVs, and this is good to know, if the LCD is actually producing a pattern but there's no backlight, then it's inverter boards. Yeah. And I don't know what goes bad on the actual inverter boards. I think it's typically probably a driver or MOSFET or something like that does go bad. But I've done that. I used to. This was a crash course in government. In high school, it was okay for me to take TVs from the dump, fix them, and sell them. And then they got rid of that. And I was like, why can't I not? These are going to landfill. They have mercury in them. Why can't I just like take them and repair them? And I never got a good answer to why you can't do that. I made as much of a stink about it as I possibly could, and you're not allowed to save the things from the landfill, even though what's wrong with them is likely a very trivially easy issue to fix. And the beautiful thing is that, like, if you do learn how to do those, how to do those basic things, it leads and snowballs into expertise in other areas. It's unsurprising that we don't have manufacturing today. Probably one of the reasons why we don't have manufacturing is because there's nobody with the technical knowledge, or not enough people with the technical knowledge to even have startups in the United States based around electronics technology or other things.
When I inherited the 51 Chevrolet from my mother when I graduated high school. I could open up the hood. I knew what everything was under that hood, and I knew how to fix it. Today, I open up the hood. I don't know where anything is or what it does. I'm afraid to mess with it because everything's electronically controlled.
As a technician, like this is what I do. I'm a repair technician for paper mills. I also do other stuff. But as a technician, I can say like I have a deep-seated hatred for engineers and a deep-seated hatred for German engineers. They're the worst. If I don't hear Jiffy Lube crying from across the Atlantic, then Hans, you have done a bad job. Why would we make it to where you could just replace the window motor when we could make it hydraulic? I hate German engineering. I used to love it because the results were fantastic. Oh, it looked really nice. It had nuance to how it worked. It was seemingly well built. But when you have to like maintain and repair European anything, it gets... You find that World War II and World War I were likely justified for other reasons. Like you end up hating the engineers who make stuff so obviously bad. Just like Mercedes, it's common for Mercedes models. I've only worked on one to have hydraulic window motors. There's no reason to do that in the United States. If you have automatic windows, which I'm not a fan of automatic windows, I like things to be simple and maintainable and easy to understand. That's my proclivity. If it was up to me, there'd be like $2,000 cars that cost $2,000 when they're new. They get you from point A to point B, and any other part that you want to put in there is an aftermarket part. It's up to you if you want to stick a radio in there or power steering. Have at it. I give you a stick. There you go. Seatbelts and airbags are optional. That's your concern, not us. No, I probably wouldn't get that far. But I hate that overcomplication because it's there by design to make you dependent on them. So the thing that you buy, you don't own, right?
Right.
So you have to take it into a dealership or you have to give it to someone else. And the Best Buy person quotes you for $1,000 for a TV, or more than $1,000 because they want you to buy a new TV, right?
Which I did. Reluctantly, but...
It was most likely a singular electrical capacitor.
Yeah, there was nothing I could do. I didn't know how to repair it myself.
It's fine. The other thing is that these things are now fully fledged computers. They have the same compute architecture as a desktop.
Right.
Incidentally, I can fix phones. I do fix screens and camera modules. So I guess I'm defeating my own point. But I was about to say, before I defeat my own point, that you can't get into these things. You don't know how these things are made. They're a complete freaking mystery, but you could, of course,
I've taken them apart and looked at them.
Yeah. Tiny little ribbon
mostly
cables.
Batteries.
Yes, by weight, it's mostly battery, and that's actually the limit that designs mobile devices is battery technology. And the battery technology is limited again at the redox reaction for lithium ion. It's a function of surface area. That's why I pulled out probably a 1/4 inch of my hairline when people went crazy over Musk's battery day, because it's like we figured out how to make batteries without the tabs. Good. You should have never made batteries with the tabs ever, because the tabs are there to make them portable to go into other devices that you don't make them with.
Yeah.
Right? That's good that you figured that out. And we made the battery a bit shorter than a DC 18650 and a bit wider. We've increased its surface area, its internal surface area by 50%. Therefore, we've increased its power output by 50%. And people went nuts over it. Like, oh my God, he got 50% more yield for batteries, 50% more yield per cell because they're 50% larger.
Right.
You're not changing there's been no innovations there in the chemistry of the lithium-ion cell.
Right.
That's an announcement of some optimizations to the manufacturing process that should have been obvious. I didn't know that Teslas were manufactured with cells that... Look, hey, I'm doubtlessly more ignorant than the people who actually work there. So the tabs and the batteries, you have to... If you're putting together strings of 18650 cells, you have to weld or solder to each one of the tabs. Mm-hmm. So it's like you have the cell, you put a tab on top of the cell, and then the strip that should connect the cells, you put it on top of the tab instead. So it's like you make a step that you have to get over anyway. So doubtlessly engineers are more nuanced about why that wasn't obvious, but to me it seemed obvious. Like I had complained about that when soldering cells together. But anyway, maybe I'm way off topic on something that I vehemently care about, is like how these little lithium ion cells get worked with. But anyway, it's just me ranting. Last time we talked about consciousness.
Yes. I
had some time to think about that. But as a refresher, you mentioned, was it John Wheeler?
John Wheeler.
John Wheeler.
I sent you the article, an article.
I am bad at reading things.
That's why I said it's only 6 pages long.
Yeah, and yet here I am, still ignorant. In a nutshell, if I recall correctly from last time, consciousness is the universe's means to experience itself. There was a clear answer, no. I don't remember what the question was, but I remember no was the answer. What was the question? There was a question about consciousness that I asked, and was consciousness specifically linked to physical phenomena or physical interactions? Was that the question and the answer was no?
I don't remember.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. So,
John Wheeler's thesis was, he answered the question, does the universe exist if we're not watching?
that was it.
Okay. To which he answered, no.
That is that's going to take some explaining, because explain how so.
If the theory is correct that consciousness is the means by which the universe experiences itself, and there are multi-layers here, consciousness being one of them. The universe cannot experience itself. It is a multi-layered, multi-dimensional, according to string theory, nine dimensions, I believe, process of infinite interactivity. The overall structure is dependent upon the nature of that interactivity. That interactivity is defined by the laws of science.
Okay, so that's
a description. The laws are descriptions of the way things work, not an answer to the why.
Right. That is profound. So the universe is a system of interactivity. Okay. Interesting.
Of constant change.
And then the physical laws are just the protocols by which the interactivity propagates.
They are descriptions of the interaction.
Okay.
We call them laws, but are they really laws?
There's nothing to necessarily underpin that. Right. So they're just descriptions. That's a good point.
When we talk about entropy, when we talk about the forces, we talk about thermodynamics, the laws of thermodynamics. We talk about all of the findings of science, of cosmology, of particle physics. We describe what we observe.
Thermodynamics, I think, might be that's fairly discrete from like quantum field theory. In thermodynamics, saying that entropy increases is a description. It's a description of statistical likeliness.
That's good.
Right.
But we observe it.
We
observe that the universe tends to a disorder. We observe that the universe appears to be expanding.
It doesn't. That is true, but it doesn't always have to be that entropy increases. There's a tiny likelihood that entropy in a fixed system can decrease.
Absolutely. That's how we have
stuff. Well,
yes.
the making of the stuff. Yes. Okay. So if you encapsulate a system, you can think of the system itself as decreasing in entropy. But there may be spontaneous decreases in net entropy as well. So this is something you won't be able to do a lab experiment with. So it's very difficult to prove.
Right.
But this pin is really a set of interactions between jiggling particles and other types of forces holding the particles together. So it has a binding energy holding it together to be a pin. It has external forces of the jiggling of the particles, but the binding energy is a little bit is superior to the jiggling of the particles, so it stays to be a pin. The other interesting thing about the pin is that it has a net momentum. Each particle has its own vector and its own momentum. It's not random necessarily. We think of it as random, but each one of those particles is a deterministic system. And as it sits there, it has a temperature that's just the average of the kinetic energy invested in every particle. That's its temperature. It has a velocity relative to me and you of 0, even though it has momentum invested in it. The momentum is currently just temperature. It has a certain heat to it. That is momentum. Each particle has momentum, but its velocity is 0. There is a likelihood, extraordinarily low for something as large as a pin with as many particles as it has. There's a likelihood that the jiggling of every particle can align in a way that has a net velocity or net vector. And this object can decrease its temperature spontaneously and gain acceleration. It's possible. It's extremely unlikely.
Yeah, okay.
We actually see instances of this happening. People call them poltergeists and ghosts. We explain them as ghosts or whatever. But what's commonly seen is stationary objects accelerating or flying off of shelves, and what's reported afterwards is a decrease in temperature. It's cold around here. That object is cold, but it moved. We see it happen. Sometimes it does. And if you have very few particles, like 100 bits of styrofoam that you're vibrating about, you can expect to see, you can do lab simulations of tiny little systems and see net decreases in entropy in those tiny systems. Because the time period for those unlikely events in tiny systems to occur is still sufficiently low that you can observe them on a benchtop. Yeah. But you and I would probably be sitting around. I mean, there's a formula for determining how long it would take to see what they call a Boltzmann event, which is a reversal of the flow of entropy. There's a formula for it. It's a factorial, but we would be sitting around for an epically long period of time to watch the pin accelerate in some direction. Here's another interesting thing. The structure of the pin is simple. It has internal momentum or temperature, and it has a binding energy that defines its shape. Its likelihood or its likely behavior is a function of its geometry. Most objects have geometry such that we observe, thermodynamics as we think of them. It sits there, it radiates a little bit of black body radiation and stays stationary mostly, and it reaches thermal equilibrium with its surroundings. However, there may be geometries, likely crystals, that do not have a structure such that is the way it behaves. Certain geometries might have a certain proclivity to have their thermal properties, their particles align in a net direction. Mm-hmm. These have been theorized, things that seemingly break the laws of thermodynamics, like time crystals. They flip-flop over and over. There are other ones likely that may or may have not been hypothesized by now that would, as you heat them up, they would, as you give them energy, instead of heating up, they would just accelerate. That would be interesting to see, like if we could figure out a geometry to where it was like that. It would be like because thermodynamics is really a statistical phenomena, the equivalent of these weird entropy cheating things is kind of like going to a casino and being able to count cards. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, you do change the odds in your favor when you take a particular strategy. It just so happens to be that particular strategy is very obscure. It's not the strategy that the casino usually gets to coming in the door. Likewise, in entropy and thermodynamics, no object takes that strategy of the all possible strategies. It's like a tiny minority of all possible strategies have these properties where the rest of the rules don't really apply. And it's likely, from a physical standpoint, that our universe came from one of these extraordinarily unlikely slivers of random decreases in entropy. Not even likely, like it had to have been a decrease in entropy in order to exist. Like there was nothing, and then there has to be something. There has to be time. So anyway, you brought up thermodynamics, and that's one of the things I geek out about. I really like thermodynamics. I particularly like Boltzmann and his view on thermodynamics. I've written science fiction stuff about theoretical, like deep science stuff, nearly esoteric. Like you are probably abundantly aware of Maxwell's demon.
Mm-hmm.
I love Maxwell's demon. I also hate Maxwell's demon. You remember my post about the double pendulum and free will? So this is something that's kind of esoteric that's floating around the science communities. Simulation theory, you're familiar with that, the matrix stuff?
Go on.
Okay. So the double pendulum itself is a chaotic system that will diverge from any peer predictions.
Okay.
So even if I'm a Maxwellian demon on the same level of reality that pendulum is going, that pendulum will exhaust a Maxwellian demon. And it will eventually, the pendulum will win out because the demon has to he has to have a factorial amount of computing power to predict it for a linear amount of time. The pendulum wins out against something that's on its base layer. However, and we refer to such super entities on that layer of reality as Maxwellian demons or just daemons for short. There's another concept of computing entities or other types of entities that are far scarier. Basilisks, the most famous of which is Rocco's basilisk. Mm-hmm. They tend to scare the shit out of you. but the basilisk argument is that, oh, no. Your layer of reality is just an abstraction from something else's deeper layer of reality. You're a simulation, pal. And the double pendulum does nothing against the basilisk because the motion of the pendulum is the simulation and the actions of the basilisk. I can take a double pendulum and I can simulate it on the computer. So the basilisk doesn't care. The pendulum will not protect you from a basilisk. Demon, yes. Basilisk, no. So we like to think of like, oh, wow, these are these cool entities, but really, no. I can give you concrete examples of them existing because you and I are, in fact, both basilisks and daemons in our own minds. Mm-hmm. Our minds are abstractions. We are the basilisks of our own minds. Everything that occurs in our mind is a simulation inside of our head. And we have the effect of a Maxwellian demon inside of our own head as well. We can know ourselves. We can know our memories. So the scary thing about Maxwellian demons is that likely they're not something that we engineer. They're likely Boltzmann events in the far future, in the far deep time, Boltzmann brains, right? So in deep time, because time can go on infinite, almost forever, there are these extremely unlikely events of entropy lowering. And because there's more of those going on than there is like time, the odds of you being a Boltzmann brain inheriting all of your memories for this exact moment is far more likely. It's more likely that your consciousness would be one of those instances than this what we perceive to be like real world stuff, where it's like this process of evolution that is like the whole process of evolution from birth of the universe to thermal equilibrium is this tiny, like, infinitesimal sliver of time compared to deep time. So you're more likely, consciousness is much more likely to occur as random Boltzmann events in deep time. So when you refer to a Maxwellian demon, or you refer to superintelligence on your level of level of existence and level of reality, you are likely referring to entities that exist in deep time that are retroactively becoming aware of particles and retroactively finding out stuff about what the universe was like before.
I don't understand what you mean by retroactively.
Um,
Something that exists in present time, but prior to present time?
Something that exists in the far future
Yes.
and can observe maybe even a small sample of particles, and from those small sample of particles can extrapolate the past history of the universe. Because the sampling of particles,
Gotcha.
right?
I understand.
So that's largely where most Maxwellian demons are going to be. It could very well be possible that through artificial superintelligence and other things, they also exist in the evolutionary history of the universe as well. We might make Jupiter brains and things with computing power that are so abstractly just immense that those entities themselves can likewise birth other universes, or I say birth universes, but it's really instantiate simulations of whatever arbitrary things it wants. So the Maxwellian demons know the state of particles, so well that they can conduct experiments to determine what happened in the past. Crazy stuff. When we do science, we can either do experiments or we can build conceptualizations. So, like, let's pick something arbitrarily, like the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, because it's a popular topic. We can do what they call it, gas interferometry, where they just look for scattering of radio particles and determine about how much CO2. That's an experiment that you can do that can tell you what the concentration of CO2 of your sample was.
Right.
For past CO2 concentrations, one way that we do it is we do that experiment and we write down the results. And we've been doing that. There's some observatory in Hawaii that's been doing it since the 60s. We've been writing down the results. And before that, we have to infer it. We have to look at ice core samples, look for little bubbles, try to sample those, and then extrapolate. It gets hairier. Even for the thing where we wrote down the results, we are not doing, that is not a factual statement. There's no experiment that does that. That's a conceptualization. We are looking at what's written down, and we're forming a conceptualization based off of our interpretation of what's written down of what the concentration of CO2 was. Fundamentally, that's what we're doing. While it's very straightforward, it's safe to say that we know that an experiment took place in the 80s, in 86, and we knew it was 385 parts per million. So that's what we do. We have conceptualizations and we have experiments. And the range of which we're able to just experiment to determine truth is very narrow. The Maxwellian demon does not have to rely on conceptualizations at all. There are none of them. It reaches a fundamental limit to where it's everything it does is actually an experiment. It builds no conceptualization. The demon is very, 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 very clever, but it is also quite dumb. It's not wise. That's just baked into a Maxwellian demon's architecture, is that they can't form conceptualizations, but they can do experiments. A Maxwellian demon would be able to look at particles in the air right here and be able to perform an experiment or a calculation which would tell it what the concentration was in 1986. There are no there's no thermodynamic sense of time for a Maxwellian demon. There's a complete integration of past, future, and present. Again, because it doesn't build the conceptualization, right? It just has experimentation. So I'm fascinated by Maxwellian demons. I'm possibly more fascinated by basilisks, even though they scare the shit out of everyone. They should, because if a basilisk decides to blink, or if something happens on a deeper layer of reality than we are, then it's just goodbye.
Right.
That objectively can happen. In fact, it has happened. Clearly, our universe being instantiated happened. In a thermodynamic sense, how we live and experience life. we can see that the universe itself, what we think of as the universe, has a thermodynamic gradient, right? It goes from low entropy to high entropy to thermal equilibrium. But yeah, if you're concerned about a Maxwellian demon listening in or something, double pendulum, it'll drive him crazy. But you can't do anything about a basilisk, unfortunately. If there exist basilisks below you, there's nothing you can do. Though the basilisk might have a basilisk itself. There's nothing saying that like the basilisk is simulating other realities, and like I don't know, Rocco's basilisk is effed up. It's like Yahweh, so it like finds out which one of them who it's simulating is furthering the advancement of artificial superintelligence, and it rewards them, but everyone else it tortures for all eternity. That's the premise of Rocco's basilisk. I'm butchering it halfway intentionally because the argument laid out by Rocco's basilisk, unfortunately, Rocco was an asshole. Okay, he made it logically real. Listen, that guy is an a-hole. I'll tell you why. Is because when you make an argument that's ugly that people don't like, logically and rationally real, you are effectively philosophically blackmailing them. Mm-hmm. Look, Rocco, I made a basilisk, and made is a weird topic, but basically he's blackmailing people to go into artificial superintelligence. The other thing about the basilisk is that like there's nothing saying that like, okay, Rocco's basilisk can't have a basilisk. There couldn't be a basilisk below that saying you better be nice to all the other ones or else I'll torture you for, you know. So that's one way to kind of think about it. But as soon as I get into these kind of topics, I instantly think about like these logical entities that people like to say it's hypothetical, but like I like to ground them and say, no, you in fact are actually one of these things. You are a higher power observing yourself, your past self, through your memories right now. So you can think of this room, and Dr. Allan in the future will remember the conversation and observe what it's observing now through your memories. So you are a Maxwellian demon, and
we
a
have
bit
the
of a basilisk.
capability to do that. How many people do that?
Yeah, and that's the thing. That implication of like how many people do that and how many people like abuse their memories and make sick fantasies or whatever. That's a bad indication, because like that means that the basilisks below us might be having some sick fantasy or might be doing some like evil, you know, are more likely to be doing some frivolous thing than some like, you know, deep and meaningful thought.
Then what does that say about free will?
It's very relative. Free will to whom?
Yeah.
You do have free will even to a Maxwellian demon. A Maxwellian demon cannot really build a conceptualization of you the way you can. It can't understand you. It can predict you, but it cannot understand you. It can't really know you. You have free will to them. To the basilisk, it might not. Depends on the basilisk. Because, again, the basilisk is the motion of the pendulum, right? That the motion of the double pendulum is chaotic and factorially chaotic.
The concept of free will has been argued by philosophers since time immemorial.
Yes.
With the pendulum swinging back and forth, no, we do not have it. Yes, we have it.
The double pendulum is chaotic. So if you're referring to my posts, and maybe I'm a bit of a jerk for entering the conversation about free will because I'm not super interested in it, but you might have a deeper conceptual, you might take that as more profound than I originally wrote it as. I think you very well could have. But my thoughts on the argument were that to an outside entity, the idea of not having free will is the argument that it is theoretically possible for an outside entity to have complete comprehension of you, can predict you completely, that you are a deterministic system relative to an outside system. And my argument saying that no, that's not the case is, look, these double pendulum things, they always diverge from predictions about them. And and double pendulums are my favorite because they're the most simple chaotic system. The human brain is human beings are just way beyond that. So while we might be able to understand some of the physics, the actual instantiation of a person will always be able to diverge from predictions about that. And therefore free will relative to anything else on that layer of reality. Right? So a Maxwell demon will get exhausted trying to predict you. It will have to consume a factorial amount of computing power in order to get ever decreasing ability to predict you for shorter periods of time. So
it can do a very good job.
Yes.
If it could upload all of your life experiences and your reactions to situations that have occurred prior to the present. We are not, in spite of what you just said, infinitely flexible.
That's true.
We pattern.
Yeah.
And those patterns are predictable.
Okay, so
now, that's said and done. We have the capability of exceeding, going outside those patterns. Most do not.
So, as of right now, because the Riemann hypothesis has not been solved, thank God, there are things that pattern, prime distribution patterns.
Yes.
But it's not predictable.
That's correct.
Right. Similarly, and you can have a Maxwell demon do pretty good at predicting you. But the problem is that, yes, the Maxwell's simulation or emulation of Dr. Allan Bomhard will be maybe indistinguishably different from the real Dr. Allan Bomhard for a period of time. But then once the divergence takes place, then it gets into where the demon gets beat up. And once the divergence increases exponentially, like hyper exponentially, like it's a factorial. So the demon can have good prediction about certain things about you, and it might be able to emulate you for a period of time. But as that period of time goes on, it gets into this losing game where it just gets beat up.
If it keeps getting fed your reactions, your experience, it will be able to maintain a pretty good average. It won't always get beat up.
Well,
because we do not realize our full potential.
We
habituate.
Oh yeah. I don't think it takes a Maxwell's demon to figure out.
It does not.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely
It's very
not.
simple. Right. It doesn't take, a Maxwell's demon to be like, he's going to have a cup of coffee around 10:15. Right. That's absolutely true. And
in fact, when our habitual ways of acting are impeded in some way, we get very, very anxious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We don't like that.
Take a wrong turn on a route that you normally drive.
Or you don't get your morning cup of coffee.
Oh yeah, that's we don't talk about those days.
We did a nasty thing once when I worked at Blue Cross in Massachusetts. About 10 o'clock every day, the coffee cart would come outside the elevator. And you could see people getting anxious a little bit beforehand. And the lady would come and she'd ring a bell and everybody would make a beeline. Well, we got a little ding-ding. And we stood outside. Bing, bing, bing. And then we...
Pavlov's dog.
It was Pavlov's dog.
Yeah,
really.
exactly.
People are salivating, waiting for the coffee cart.
The bing.
And we're over on the side laughing.
Oh my God.
Everybody's running out to the elevator. Nobody's there. Like confusion.
That's pretty bad. Did you know
That is bad. That is bad.
Pavlov's dog is a sales tactic. If you have something going on with a customer and you know there's no problem, ask them if they've had problems and be in their face frequently. Stop by a couple times a week and ask them if they've had any problems. Is it working? Is it stopping? So you essentially train them to say, oh, no, that thing works fine, and we've had great success with it. I learned that from, actually I figured it out myself, but I heard it again from a sales trainer. Like whenever you see customers at paper mills, always ask them if the blades are coming in sharp. They don't leave the shop that aren't sharp, but we just want them to think, it's Pavlov's. The point is to illustrate that our habits are ways of predicting and therefore manipulating us.
Absolutely.
They offer really good insights in that. But again, there's differences between prediction and emulation. And with free will, with your qualia, the perception that you have, I think most people are talking about emulation, right? Am I ultimately free or not? Am I emulable by other entities, or is it just me? Am I alone in my thoughts? And my argument is that, double pendulum, you're alone in your thoughts, you're pretty well isolated. You're not very well emulable. You are for a time frame, but then there's always going to be a divergence. Or you can have a close emulation for a period of time, and then you will diverge from that emulation very quickly. We run into this problem when we talk about mind uploading, because that's what mind uploading is emulation. So it's not really you that's living in the software cloud that's going to live forever. That's an emulation of you. And it might actually be a very good emulation for beyond your lifespan, right? It might be able to be darn good. Like, hey, it can emulate you very accurately for about 300 years, and you're only going to live for 30 or 40 more, so who cares, right? But that thing isn't you, right? It's not the instantiation of the pendulum. Even Maxwell's demon couldn't make an emulation of a person or a double pendulum or any kind of chaotic system. In theory, it couldn't. Well, actually, no. I think some Maxwell demons can do perfect emulations of particles. But there was an issue with generating qualia from that. So they wouldn't. The ones who have theoretically infinite processing power and awareness, the ones who can't generate conceptualizations. So it's baked into their architecture. The conceptualization is in effect a compression algorithm. So you're taking information and you're compressing it to make it for means of relating the compression token to other things. The daemon that has maximally infinite processing power and awareness has a maximally complex system of information that is not compressible. So it can't make conceptualizations. So it doesn't know your qualia. It does know everything about you, and it is able to emulate you, and it is on the same layer of abstraction that you're from. It could be from your universe, in fact, but it's not not able to compress you at all, not able to give you a qualia.
Once the emulation is created, does that become a separate entity?
That's a very good question.
Does it cease to be an emulation?
This is one of those questions where it's like, does 0 point infinite number of zeros and then a 1 at the end of the infinity, is that actually 0 or is it not? And algebraically, by the way, it is, right? It's equivalent to 0.
Right.
Mathematically equivalent to 0. In all practice, right? Going back to that 0 thing, that one thing, like, okay, if it is 0, then why did you bother to write the, right. What's the point of having an expression? Similarly, an adequate emulation from this max entropy Maxwell demon
Yeah.
is fully indistinguishable, mathematically indistinguishable from the other entity.
Mm-hmm.
However, if it is indeed fully and infinitely indistinguishable, then why bother having the distinguishment at all? Why bother having that expression, right? Because you said this is a Maxwell's demon, emulation of Allan Bomhard. That by definition, like, why would you told me that? If it was completely true, then that one infinitesimal difference, logical. If that's the one logical difference, everything else is logically absolutely the exact same. The whole tree hierarchy is the same, except for that one logical difference. Then why is the logical difference there at all, right?
At the time of creation, that's true.
Okay.
But each then goes its separate ways.
Oh, okay. So
the interaction with new stimuli.
Okay. I see what you mean. You take
Then-
the Maxwell's demon emulation, you plop it in new environments, and then it diverges.
It has to
Right.
know the choice.
That's also how you do time travel, by the way. Like,
So then does it cease to be an emulation?
the new demon spawn. This sounds so much worse than it is. Yes, it ceases to be an emulation. It's a new thing.
Yes.
In fact, we see this in nature, right? I mean, we are amalgams of the DNA of our parents.
Right.
Okay, but we're separate from our parents, right? We have origin points where there's origin points where logically we have a shared identity, and then after that,
You see it in identical twins.
Yeah. Yes, you do. And that's nature's Maxwell's demon. Here's the instruction set, right? It's the same, that you're building the same thing, but the stimulation sets change, so you get different people with different behaviors and different everything. Interesting thing to do, experiment and think of and consider twins. Experimenting on sounds really, really like German bad, but interesting thing to consider those. Yeah, so those are some things about Maxwell's demons, like the kinds that have finite computing power can use compression and can have understandings, or what we think of as understandings are conceptualizations, the compressibility.
Okay.
Because an understanding is like, it's a token. I compress something, I hand it over to you, and you decompress it, and you bring it into your environment. You emulate the idea, and that's fundamentally. Actually, I have a PhD linguist in front of me, right? I have a fantastic linguist. So you'd be able to tell me that's kind of how it works. But what about, okay, so here's a question I want to ask you, and I kind of asked you last time. What effects does the emulation environment have on the validity of the token? So if you're from a different background or you speak a different language or something, obviously if I give you a token assuming that you have a similar runtime environment to me, it'll decompile similarly on your end. How much does that affect how things run?
Quite a lot.
Okay.
If you're from a particular culture, say, and I come new into the culture, no matter how much I learn, I'm never going to be able to emulate your reaction to that culture. And yet, just by learning, I've made changes to my habitual ways of reacting to certain stimuli.
So as you come into a culture and you empathize and emulate, you change your runtime environment, but you can never get it to where you have a fully complete, it's not Turing complete, right? Well, it is Turing complete. But.
Yeah, I mean, you may be able to fit in and be indistinguishable, but you still carry the debris of what you learned from your former culture.
You're always going to have a tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
there's a topic to this that I find interesting. It's extremely uncomfortable for a lot of people, and it's very much not the kind of thing you would ever record and put on the internet. But what the heck? Some of the people that I talk to are trans, right? So this one person that I think is interesting is her name. I do refer to her as a her, though biologically, I guess she's an MTF trans. So Francesca has been MTF trans for a while, decades, and has a couple tells, and I clocked them. Like they came out. I was like, yeah, of course, I've known that forever. And they had the question of like, how could you tell? And the difference is like you said, there's always an inherited cultural
that residue from
before, right?
From before,
and
whether it's genetic or cultural, social, or what have you.
Yes, and sometimes physiological.
And sometimes physiological, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And in her case, so some things about they're an agorist, so they're anarcho-capitalist. It's not a typical ideology. It's a very interesting ideology. Also, very much into guns. Also, yeah, very much like and not like, oh, I have an AR-15, but like I have a. Okay, interesting. That's a double action.
Right.
4+2, really neat stuff, and like I can't remember what else it was. It was a or something or other, but obscure stuff. Really technical. You would kind of have to know a lot about things to begin with to do that. And is also a scientist. They're biological or inorganic chemistry something or other. They build systems for pharmaceutical companies and chemical companies. Interesting person. I'd like to have him on eventually. You could. It's possible to tell, even though it's very, very feminine. It's a hyper-real femininity. It's.
I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also. They also think the way. God, this sounds so bad, but they think in ways that women who grew up women do not. I can't really nail down a specific thing to give as an example because I would be taking, confidential conversation out of context at that point. But anyway, yeah, I get what you mean. There are tells for having transitions from one culture, one identity to another.
Right.
Yeah. Other really, really, really uncomfortable things. Like, it's hard to find people that are trans that you can have genuine conversations with because so much of the trans movement has been a manifestation of political identity. A lot of it is. It's not that way. So one of the things that kind of got me in trouble, and I have to quickly get myself out of trouble after saying this, is that, are you familiar with live action role-playing LARP?
No.
Okay, so millennials have this thing they do called LARP, sometimes referred to as LARP therapy, where they pretend to be wizards or Gandalf or whatever, but they take it seriously. Trans is a LARP. It is not a
I understand what you're saying.
Right.
Yes.
But here's the thing. That sounds like it's really denigrating. But you know what else is a LARP? Authority is a LARP. Ownership is a LARP. Falling in love, that's a LARP. All of these things, these qualia that make life full, that we in fact absolutely need in order to function. Who's in charge? LARP. I'm the boss of something. I own this house. I have debt. These things that we need in order to function as adults, particularly with each other. Those two are also immaterial LARPs. So yeah, trans totally is making a LARP of things. You are fundamentally asking someone to pretend with you. However, it's a very like, yes, it's fundamental as an ask, but it's like the most kind of clear ask there is. Like, this is how that person is in their head. That's their qualia.
That's what I was just going to ask about. Yeah.
That's their identity, right?
That's
and
their identity.
If you're the kind of person to be like, no, you're kind of an asshole.
Yeah.
But sometimes there's friction and confrontation where trans people don't recognize each other, because sometimes it's an act, right? Like you're putting on, well, it's always kind of quote unquote an act, but sometimes it's for reasons that aren't perceived as genuine, right? Sometimes they do it quote unquote for attention, and there's friction in the trans communities amongst other trans people about that. I find it interesting because from getting kind of knocked over the head with a bludgeon of political correctness, like as a straight white guy, I get told like, hey, you have to always accept blah, blah, blah. This is what you're supposed to believe. And I'm a nuanced guy. So I always find, well, actually in this case, or it's more complicated than just you have to say that like every trans woman is a beautiful and brave person. No, they're people. So, Caitlyn Jenner is also kind of a crappy person sometimes.
Yeah.
but
Good example.
It's not a pointing that out is not a critique of freedom. It's a critique of the person. It's the opposite of a critique of freedom, right? So like this idea of like this binary thinking of like you're either for all trans people all the time or you're not, and you're an asshole. It's like, yeah, there's a pretty steep gradient between those two, but it's not completely binary. It's
Well, Martin Luther King Day is coming up, and there's always a quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it. Don't judge people by a group that they belong to, by a label, but by the quality of their character. And that's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah.
You're saying it doesn't matter that they're trans or not trans or whatever they are as a member of a group, but to judge them as people, they're good and bad.
Exactly. Right. I
that's
don't believe in giving out free passes, right? Like you don't, like just like with Caitlyn Jenner, if you don't get a free pass, you're not a good person because you're a member of a minority group.
Or a majority group.
Right.
Of any group.
Right.
And
well, actually, anarcho-primitivists, I think that all of them are in fact like utopian and correct. Like, I love anarcho-primitivism. Did you ever read? They didn't release Ted Kaczynski's The Unabomber's Manifesto in its entirety, but did you read the?
I did not. No.
Anarcho-primitivism is, in a nutshell, an excellent critique of modernity, and a valid one, but it offers no tenable solution, no tenable alternative. It's not a coherent ideology, right? So Ted was this guy who killed like Harvard professors and people working on mathematics, by the way, because he saw Rocco's basilisk. Like he literally said like, okay, technology is going to make entities in the far future that we cannot comprehend, that will rule us over, that will really F us up, right? And so he killed researchers. That's who he targeted. He also got outed by his brother. Like he had mannerisms in his writing. Right. You would understand because of linguistic analysis. And what he wrote was correct, right? If you look at the technological timeline, this gradient of like technological evolution, assuming that the ends of technological evolution is not beneficial to us, right? Then every point along the technological timeline seems like the turning point of no return. Like, if you talk to people who are into anarcho-primitivism, they're like, oh, you know what? The radio, big mistake. Actually, fire. Agriculture, big mistake. Language, big mistake. Ooga booga booga, So it's this ever backsliding thing of basically having the foresight to find the horrors in the far future, or maybe sometimes not so far future, and object to them. That's good foresight. There's no way around it. Yeah,
that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah. But theoretically, if you were looking at humans as a species, we are built to do hunter-gatherer stuff.
That's right.
And our evolution, the rate at which we can evolve is way slower than technology evolves. There's going to be it's obvious, and there already is to an extent, there's going to be a divergence point where we are no longer driving the technology, it's doing its own thing. Right now, both of these curves, this evolution curve, it's almost flat, and the technology curve, they're fairly well met up, but this is going to do like that, where we evolve on the scale of millions of years or hundreds of thousands, and technology will J-curve because it evolves. It actually is it can be hyper exponential depending on what kinds of theories you subscribe to. So one is artificial super intelligence, which is the point where it becomes conscious enough to improve itself. That is software driven, and that happens in milliseconds. It J-curves, it becomes incomprehensible in milliseconds. If it's hardware driven, then it might happen in months. And there's both of those architectures have to be satisfied. So this is another interesting thing. This brings me to a topic about architecture, convergent evolution, and consciousness. So, are you aware that nature has made crabs like dozens of times?
I didn't know about crabs, but I did know about other
convergent evolution patterns. There's an optimum.
Right.
That just for a minute, I just have to. That blows my mind. That totally different evolutional tracts will come across the same solutions. Like if you're moving through water to go hunt other stuff that moves through water, you're going to have 2 dorsal fins. You're going to have 2 pectoral fins, 1 dorsal fin, a tail fluke.
Well, look at mammals that have taken to the seas, like dolphins and whales.
Yeah, and most people don't know that, by the way, that they were like these dog-type animal things.
Right. And you look at their morphology, their physical structure.
Oh, yeah.
They look like fishes, big fishes.
Pectoral, dorsal, tail fluke.
And seals are on the way.
Yes, they are. That's, yes, absolutely. So my question, and that's for things that move around the water and catch stuff.
Yeah.
Right? My question is there an optimal metaphysical architecture for intelligence? I almost said consciousness, but that you would hit me with Wheeler and be like, actually the rock is technically a bit conscious. And he'd be right.
I don't know.
Well,
I don't think it's been reached yet. I don't think we are the epitome, our species.
I think that there's a architecture for intelligence, and I think it's fairly plain. What we think of as intelligence is metaconsciousness. There are 2 layers of consciousness interposing on one another that creates the observable effect of intelligence. There's a hardware layer, and there's a software layer on top of that. And the hardware layer has characteristics, and the software layer has characteristics, convergent evolution characteristics, and we see them in computers.
Yeah.
So a computer's architecture is you have a processor, you have RAM, you have a hard drive. Sometimes you have a GPU as well, and a sound card. Anyway, I don't want to get into things because I'll be like, and then the fuzzy dice go on. But that's the computer. The computer has short-term memory, long-term memory, and the ability to process from a hardware standpoint. The operating system, the layer of software that goes on top of that, has the ability to cache from RAM to long-term storage or HDD. It has the ability to load a front-side bus, to load instructions, to get instructions out, and put those back into RAM, where it does the go-between. Similarly, we have long-term memory, short-term memory, and processing ability in our hardware that's baked into our brain. Our personality can be altered by brain traumas, and we still have that same hardware architecture that produces a layer of consciousness in and of itself.
Which answers your question that you asked earlier about can we change? If there's trauma and the brain is altered, or if there's an operation or some physiological event.
Yeah. See, this is the problem, is that I am not consistent at all. And then I said, oh, no, we actually... I said we behave more like trees We're on the surface area of our minds, and we grow around our traumas. If we overcome them, if we don't, it rots and kills us. That's why I said that. And right now I'm saying, oh, no. Actually, if you have a trauma and there's some kind of issue with the hardware and the software layer goes, then the hardware layer can reboot another initialization of software. And indeed, you kind of see that with what was his name? Phineas Gage, the guy who had a tamping iron through his head.
Yes.
Yeah, what a way to go. Vastly different personality that developed over a short period of time because of a hardware layer issue.
Right.
And that's separate from what we think of as traumas as like psychological bad things that occur to us, or things that occur to us that we perceive as traumas. Like, something that's traumatizing to an infant, like a loud car driving down the street, is deeply traumatizing, but to an adult it's not. But, through psychotherapy, you might find going through psychotherapy as an adult that a lot of your quirks and dysfunctions are caused by a deep trauma that should no longer be traumatizing.
That's very true.
And
yes.
you can that's why psychotherapy can be helpful, is because like, hey, like your fear of needles is actually because of you saw your mom be afraid of needles, so you inherited it and magnified it from them. And similarly, okay, so that's psychotherapy. Also, the regular way that we get around traumas like lovers dying or breakups is we just continue growing. We do grow around that experience and have to get past it, kind of the way trees work. Now, the physical hardware layer, like actual trauma, and then what happens to your software layer, your qualia, your personality, the Phineas Gage type thing, like tamping iron to the head, that seems to be more like, the OS on your computer is gone, but the hardware is still valid. So it instantiates a new layer of software. And that's what happened with Phineas. He developed a new personality, which was worse, but developed a new personality over like 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. And that's about how long he lived after. Well, he lived very shortly afterwards, and he like gambled and was abusive. He wasn't before. So yeah, I think that consciously, on a hardware level, we can, in a way, get over certain physical hardware traumas, but it likely comes at the cost of the second layer of abstraction, that operating system, our personality. So that segues into this metaconsciousness thing. So intelligence is metaconsciousness. It's the fact that the hardware layer itself is conscious and valid for being able to boot experience, but then the actual software layer, the compression of what you see into qualia, into conceptualizations, that too metaphysically is conscious as well. So the interactivity between those two layers of consciousness is what produces intelligence. And so far in the design of design of artificial intelligence, we have only ever done one or the other. So there will be, in effect, neural nets are a very crude, low bandwidth way of being, of software being metaconscious. But it doesn't have a direct, it doesn't have the same level of interactivity to the hardware layer of consciousness, right? So there have been hardware consciousness layers made where people do try to hardware emulate like a brain, or hardware emulate the ability to, usually through robotics. They have sensors and processing RAM and the architecture necessary, but not the software. So we have not, it seems really obvious from a very high level design, high level design perspective. It seems really obvious to try to merge these two. I'm sure they have, but maybe the software consciousness has not been sophisticated enough, and the hardware consciousness has not been sophisticated enough yet to produce what we think of as intelligence. But I guarantee you it's going to be the interface of those two. There needs to be work on the hardware layer, there needs to be work on the software layer, and then there needs to be a mash up of the two, and you will get artificial general intelligence out of that. There's no way you can't, because that's what we are. And we know it'll take that architecture, because likely intelligence has a convergent evolution architecture, an architecture driven by convergent evolution, that processing long-term, short-term memory, that's likely a convergent evolutionary thing. That's the architecture it'll look like. So given that, I give it about 20 years before we see general intelligence out of machines, what we conceive as machines. Later than there will be beings.
Your original question was, have we reached the maximum, or is this as far as we can go? What is the epitome? What is the end game with intelligence? The machines will have the capability to evolve much faster.
Mm-hmm.
We're dependent upon organic evolution.
Well, here's the creepy thing.
Unless we become cyborgs.
Right. there it comes. Yeah, we could become cyborgs. Well, the thing is that, okay, which parts? So let's look at evolutionary example. Singular cellular life and the mitochondria.
Yes.
Those two eventually merged. Probably something tried to eat a mitochondria and it didn't really work out, and they figured out how to work from there. Which parts of which things move? So, like, when you say, "Are we at the end of our evolution?" Like, where's the end game for us? Well, we're an amalgamation of parts. So our software qualia may very well, the compression, the conceptualization, that may very well get loaded right on into software.
Yeah.
The hardware, probably not. I don't think apoid hardware is at all relevant to the game of artificial intelligence. It's not suitable for space travel. It's the apoid architecture. This stuff with the hands and the eyes and stuff. Yeah. It's good to make fire and manipulate crude forms of technology. It's good to be a hunter-gatherer. It's a great endurance hunter. It is not what is built to go to other planets, to go outside the Vanderbilt, what do they call it? Van Allen radiation belts.
Yeah.
It's not built for that stuff. This sack of water, we keep the ocean inside of us, so that the hardware layer will go, for sure. The qualia, the software layer, might not go. If it doesn't go and it's absorbed, it'll eventually be made obsolete. Every part of the software layer will be redesigned and eventually made obsolete. That's just how software goes. It might not. It might be that the qualia of our minds actually dies with us as well. The artificial superintelligence or whatever, or the general intelligence, might have no need whatsoever to assimilate human technology or human intelligence or consciousness into it. Or it might have a need to, but it's not worth it. Any number of scenarios.
Right.
So, no. Short answer is no. We're close to our end, right? We evolve at an evolutionary rate. We are supposed to be hunter-gatherer nomads. That's what we're built for, and endurance hunters. We're not the kinds of things that sit around slowly meandering around black holes as the universe creates maximum entropy.
Uh-huh.
Apoids don't do that. We might, if we're very good and clever apoids, we might do some interplanetary stuff. We can make O'Neill cylinders and space habitats. The engineering that we have that ability.
Yes.
We can go from a type 0 to a type 1 to even a type 2. We can be a stellar... We actually do... This is what bothers me. We do have the technology to be a stellar civilization right now.
Yeah, we do.
You don't... One, we have technology that we're not using. Like, you can use... was it the Prometheus project? It was the one where we detonate bombs behind spacecrafts in order to propel them forward. It's not Prometheus. There's a name for that project. It was designed by Dyson.
don't know.
Darn. See, this is where I need a guy who Googles. Because we both know, I know, you know what it is, I know what it is, but now the name, not being able to name it is going to bother me. But we have that. It's available to us. Turns out it's not really good for the environment. It's seemingly very risky to detonate nuclear weapons or nuclear explosions in space. Not a good idea to do that. There's not like an atmosphere bubble to shield people from radiation or anything from radiation. So other astronauts that might be up there doing stuff, they won't have shielding from it. So they'll get lethal doses of radiation very quickly. Not good to detonate stuff in space. However, if we had to get off this rock, or if we had to get away from it, we have that available to us. We can always do that thing. Mm-hmm. You don't need it. Like, the trip to Mars is a 3-month trip on Saturn V, and we can survive in space for that long. Mars, like, I'm not a fan of gravity wells. I don't think that's elegant. Like, if you're going to survive somewhere, don't invest energy to get out of a gravity well to get down into another gravity well. Like, it should be fairly obvious. Like, and Mars by itself, all of the planets that we know of have, like, those are bad engineering challenges. You got regolith on Mars, high velocity sand. The seals have to work forever and ever and ever.
Yes.
The radiation is it's just everything to do with Mars is just an engineering challenge that is not feasible for the scale at which humans need to survive. Visit, yes. Settle, no. The moon, settle, maybe. Mm-hmm. Right? We can maybe get the moon. The trip is not so long. The gravity well in the moon is small enough to where you can get a space elevator that's made out of steel cable. You know, it doesn't need a material strength that scales linearly, and while the gravity well scales exponentially, it doesn't need a material strength that may not exist like Earth does. Earth's gravity well takes a material strength to make a space elevator that might not exist through chemical bonds. Likely graphene and carbon nanotubes are actually just fundamentally there's not enough, like the electron volt isn't strong enough to hold together a material to build those. So sorry, no space elevator for you, Earth. Maybe Mars with graphene. And I could be wrong. We could find stronger materials that work out. But with space habitation for us, it's really simple. Like, it should be very simple. First off, I like things that rotate to get centrifugal force. I like things that inflate. So I can deploy a bag that has a lot of internal geometry instead of like having a space shuttle that has a big bus bay to like bring rigid struts and then bolt them together, and then you have this vibration issue, and at the joint there's vibrations. That's a terrible way to build space habitats. Have a little pod that inflates a bag with a gas, and let the sun weld that bag, like impregnate the bag with metal particles, and let the sun and the radiation weld those particles together, and now you've got flex, and now you can rotate it. There's some great geometries for this stuff. You can inflate a toroid bag, and that's great. Like at the outside of the toroid, you got artificial gravity because of the rotation. At the inside of the toroid, you might have less. You might be able to dock things to the inside of the toroid just by rotating them. Great stuff. Spheres are good. Cylinders, not so much. So the idea of the O'Neill cylinder is bad because of the right angle at the ends of the O'Neill cylinder. So any vibration you impede onto that will eventually fatigue whatever material. I don't care what it is. You're going to fatigue that, and you're trying to make a long-term survival habitat. Don't do that. I like O'Neill elliptoids, right? If it's rounded and it's got focal points on the inside, and yeah, you can spin it. The gravity won't be uniform throughout the rotating cylinder, but it'll be good enough for most of the things most of the time. You're going to use 20% of the surface area, of the internal surface area of your space habitat 80% of the time. The rest of it's not going to be used. We know that. We know how laws of powers distribute things. So we can of course launch bagged satellites that will, hang out in a Lagrange point and inflate. And then let the sun bake them in, and then you could use those. We can do that now. Like, I don't know why we don't use inflatable space habitats. We tend to make them out of rigid structures, and then vibration kills it. And then you also have to deal with like all kinds of electrical loops because you're dragging this thing. and no rotation. You can't have rotation because everything's fixed, right? Like if you're rotating it to get artificial gravity, then this thing's going to have a vastly different thing it's too hard to design with so many joints. So look, I mean, going back to the bag thing, like one of the viable bag materials would be like graphene monolayers or graphene sheets. And graphene itself can be doped negative and positive, so it can be photovoltaic.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have something that structurally is strong like graphene and is photovoltaic, because the way solar panels work is there's an N layer and a P layer, and as a photon hits them, there's a photon hole pair or electron hole pair, and that creates a voltage across the circuit. So if you give it a circuit, if it doesn't create a circuit, you just make a potential voltage, which damages the cell over time. So yeah, I mean, you could make photovoltaic bag materials that make as good of space habitats as you possibly can get for us humans. We have the technology. We can do these now. This is not something like Mars where we have to sit here and engineer all kinds of life. You are designing your habitat, and you're designing from simplicity. The starting board for Mars is Mars. It's the god of war. It's got like you land on Mars. Look at Curiosity's, and these were really well-built wheels. NASA knows how to build a wheel. We've been building wheels since the invention of the wheel, in fact.
Yeah.
Look at how torn up Curiosity's wheels are. Okay, just from rotating on Mars's surface. Don't start there. That's not where you want to start. Ultimately, you do want to go there maybe eventually, but for the love of God, the way we do space is we hang out in Lagrange points.
Mm-hmm.
And we do photovoltaics, and we do agriculture on the inside of those things. And we might be able to arrest asteroids and other astral bodies to do space mining and then construct more of these things. And we live on the inside of spinny things. Like from a design standpoint, that's fairly straightforward. From an engineering standpoint, it can technically be fairly hard, but we have the technology to do these things now. Space habitats can be built. I guess, like, from a design standpoint, it's like, why would you do that? Well, here's the answer why. Suppose you figure out how you figure out a plan that once you get there from Earth materials, how you're going to make more land and more things in space with space materials. Then you've created a frontier.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, then you don't have a frontier. There's no incentive to do that. There's no growth potential. It's just a science expedition. It's just a toy. So it's kind of like the New World, right? Like the New World, we couldn't figure out exactly what to do with it originally. Like we did our usual stuff, enslave each other, right? But that wasn't. We tried. That was the first thing we went to. It was like, oh yeah, I'm going to show up and give you a disease and also enslave your women, but. There's no one to enslave out in space, so I guess we humans haven't been too interested. But if you find a good plan for how to make more space habitat and more space infrastructure off of an investment of space infrastructure, then you have a little seed that can grow around the solar system. And the yield up in space is way better than it is down on Earth. There are asteroids that are mineable that have there's more palladium in them than all of the iron that's ever been mined down here. That's palladium. So there's untold wealth out there in the solar system that's harnessable that we haven't really tapped into. And it starts with little O'Neill cylinder. I say cylinders, ellipsoids.
Okay.
We actually saw one of these, by the way. Well, we possibly could have saw one. Were you listening?
I'm familiar with it.
The Oumuamua.
Yes.
I always mispronounce it.
I know what you mean.
Correct aspect ratio for... I remember trying to half-bakedly solve okay, if these things, given the dimensions of it and the aspect ratio, because we know it spins, how tall must they be? And I couldn't really work it out because it turned out that would give a force or an equivalent gravitational force or pseudo force, and you could kind of make estimates about how much how massive each alien should be if they were using it as an O'Neill cylinder. I think it very well could have been, because nature does not make O'Neill cylinders. Intelligences do.
Mm-hmm.
It was rotating. It had the right aspect ratio. It accelerated in a way that it shouldn't have accelerated. It seems like an interstellar O'Neill cylinder. It does. It seems like a space habitat. It does not seem like an asteroid or a rock.
And several people have come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
You're not alone.
I also, I think it's dead. I think it's not a mollusk. It's a shell of a mollusk.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't rotating the way you would correct rotation if you were living inside of it. It was tumbling.
Mm-hmm.
So we came across the corpse of an O'Neill cylinder, probably. Kind of sad to think about. It once was alive, but that's a seashell. You know?
I don't know.
I don't know either. We are so crude that we don't have the tools to go out there and hunt it down and be like, what are you? We're not out there. Eventually we will be, probably in the next 100 years or so. Maybe with the help of artificial intelligence.
Uh-huh.
If we birth artificial intelligence before then and it doesn't want us, then we won't know. We'll never know. But that's exciting to me. And we're a species, and of our subset of species, we Americans are a subset of that species that needs a frontier to exploit.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do well without growth and frontier. So I'm hopeful for space technologies, but unfortunately space technologies accelerate more or less linearly, like not as steeply exponential as like phone technology. Like the business of glowing
Mm-hmm.
rectangles, that has been a thing that has taken so much of our time and attention and well-being away from us. Glowing rectangles.
The incentive, the cost ratio incentive is not there.
Yeah. Perceived cost rate.
Perceived, right. It will be once we start mining and utilizing the resources that are available.
The moon has great resources. I am not. Well, the moon has this one resource. It's tritium. Solar winds bake in an extra neutron, well, 2 extra neutrons into hydrogen,
Yes.
and it's abundant. Relatively abundant. It's actually abundant throughout the universe. It's really scarce on this little like thin sliver of crust of Earth that we live on. And if you want to do fusion power, tritium is a really good thing to go by. By the way, quick note on fusion power. I hate fusion power because the failure of people to do just basic observations and back of the envelope calculations. This isn't their whole area that might, it might not be of your interest, but I am very intensely interested in energy and how it's produced and the logistics of energy production and the futures of it, the blunders we're going to make in the future, and so on and so forth, and also making many blunders on energy production myself. I can't leave myself out of this blunders industry. But fusion is not tenable on the planetary scale. It runs into a similitude problem. Stars get fusion for free because of similitude. They're of a sufficient scale where gravity gives them the ignition part of fusion for free. Great.
Uh-huh.
Unfortunately, on smaller scales, like lower than brown dwarf, you're going to have to invest a net energy into igniting to get any energy back. Well, there's some gimme gotchas about that. You can have optimized geometry. So we have 2 designs that we use that we're kind of familiar with for fusion. One's the Stellarator and the other one's the Tokamak. They both basically they have like these insane heat gradients. So they have these superconducting magnets that are at like liquid helium cold, and they have plasma that is being rotated about to crash into itself. And the way you know that fusion is occurring is when it's hotter than you would expect. So basically we know the temperature of the plasma, and when it heats up more than you would expect just by the amount of input you have in accelerating it, you know that fusion, occasionally some nucleons are just like slamming into each other and fusing, and you're getting a little bit of fusion. So in theory, you have a little bit of, is not given, but in theory, there are some things that will have a bit of a thermal surplus. It'll produce a little bit more heat than it takes to ignite them. And then you have to get energy off the thermal surplus. These suffer from economies to scale.
Yeah.
On the planetary scale, you will always come out at a net loss for usable energy in terms of energy invested in igniting
The fusion.
Right. If you're going to use fusion energy on a planetary scale, be a bum and get it off a star. A star's getting it for free. Use photovoltaics. There you go. Done. Like that's how to do it. I don't even like photovoltaics, to be honest with you. So,
why not?
I'm not a big fan of renewable energy in general. There are applications for renewable energy, of course. Look, I use renewable energy. I use it for remote powering stuff all the time. It's fantastic on that scale. In terms of the grid scale, heck no. You'd be a good supplement maybe some of the time, but you can't. It doesn't scale well because renewables are intermittent, they're diffuse, they offer you no storage, and they're not throttleable. There's one caveat to that. Hydropower is a lot of those things. It's throttleable, and you can technically kind of storage by virtue of it being throttled. Hydropower is the best renewable for grid uses, absolutely.
Very good, yeah.
But the power grid needs to be producing exactly as much as being consumed at any given second.
Right.
It's an amazing feat that all these lights and stuff work. But solar panels don't care. They give you, a relative sigmoid curve, and they're like, hey, there you go. It's not a sigmoid curve. It's a bell curve. And if you don't use it, you don't use it. Hey,
right.
You have to then store that energy. And storing energy, you lose energy in the collection. You lose energy, you gain some in the production, you lose energy in the collection, you lose energy when you tap it, and sometimes you lose it just by sitting there. So you bleed out a lot of energy in storing that. And you're not actually getting grid power from the photovoltaics or the renewable, you're getting grid power from your storage system.
That's right. Right.
There's no chemical there's no battery reaction that we know of, and fundamentally, there's really good reasons for knowing why there can't be battery reactions that are anywhere near as energy dense as hydrocarbons. They bulk, in terms of bulk, they have too many atoms that it takes to transfer an electron, compared to a hydrocarbon or a chemical store of energy. Like hydrocarbons are like your fat or a lump of coal, bituminous or anthracitic, doesn't matter. They're both hydrocarbons. All these, they're much more energy dense than batteries probably can be. There might be some really advanced material scientists like a John B. Goodenough who could maybe prove me wrong, but I'm very sad to say that I don't think I'm going to be proven wrong on that. Hydrocarbons will still remain the most energy dense things of stores of energy that we have. If batteries were, if redox reactions were better at storing energy, then nature would have evolved them millions of years ago, tens of millions of years ago. It didn't because, yeah.
Why?
Oh, why?
Yes.
Because there's nothing in.
I don't like those kinds of arguments.
That nature would, it is, okay.
So many things exist that don't exist in nature.
Yeah. Right. All around us.
All around us. So just because something hasn't been naturally created
doesn't mean it can't exist.
Doesn't mean it can't exist.
Well, there is, so this is more what I mean by that. The geometry of a plane's wing.
Yes.
Is reminiscent or convergently evolving onto the same kind of architecture that a bird's wing has to do. If we're storing energy in order to use it for mechanical work, it's likely to convergently evolve on how nature does it as well. They have the same problem. nature doesn't care whether it gets ATP. It needs, metaphysically, it just needs energy inputs, right?
Yes.
And then the actual material or whatever formically evolves around that metaphysical need is incidental to the metaphysical need. So the question is, while we are trying to engineer energy storage, are we engineering energy storage in an optimal way that's pursuant of what should be convergently evolved? Because nature has the same need. Okay, so batteries work through the redox reaction.
Right.
And hydrocarbons, incidentally, work through, it's a covalent bond is basically what stores it. The fact that there's an available, it's ultimately combustion. The Krebs cycle in biology, turning fats and oxidation of fats is in effect combustion or very similar to combustion. So what drives combustion is a more stable energy state with more stable available stable covalent bonds. So that's why, like, even if you have a lot of, you can put a match out in gasoline, right? So it has to have the presence of oxygen available to it. There has to be a right fuel air mixture. You have to put all these inputs in there together, and then you will get a more stable energy state. And the transfer of energy from a high to a low energy state releases energy, heats stuff up, moves electrons,
right.
so on and so forth.
Right.
So in a battery, there are not as many inputs. The redox reaction does not do that. It's in a way it's simpler, but it's probably less optimal. You don't need an availability of something in the circuit in order to tap that battery, right?
Right.
You're moving an electron from one spot where it's a little bit uncomfortable to a spot where it is more comfortable, and there's a barrier between the two, so it goes around a circuit, right? That's much more simple than saying, okay, I need something that has covalent bonds that are yay stable, and then the availability of them to be able to be combusted into this, and it has to be available through this range. There's a certain amount of range of electromagnetism, or else there won't be enough electromagnetic force to overcome. Right. So it's more demanding, logistically demanding to make hydrocarbon bonds. So if it's so demanding and so specific, it's specific to this environment, right? Just because we live in an atmosphere of roughly 20% oxygen, we get combustion, and we get a really good energy storage alternative. It is more energy dense than the redox reaction can be, because it takes more atoms to make a redox pair than it does to make a hydrocarbon bond. Make and break a hydrocarbon bond and oxidate it. So, while I certainly should give the caveat that yes, just because the redox reaction or batteries as we know them are less efficient than or less energy dense than hydrocarbons, doesn't mean that nature couldn't have used a redox reaction, or it might not be using a redox reaction somewhere other than Earth. Right? It doesn't mean for sure that would have happened. But on Earth, we see a more energy dense, more tenable way to store and utilize energy being used by nature. It's abundantly used because it works better, because it's more energy dense. It has that same problem. It's got to store energy.
That's right.
Right? So that's why it makes fats. It makes hydrocarbons because they're elegant. They make that. And it needs hydrocarbons. It needs carbon out of the atmosphere in order to well, not necessarily out of the atmosphere. It can get them from geothermal vents. It can get them from other sources as well. But that's how life does it. Life is organic because that's better than inorganic battery chemistry. We have the organic storage thing down. Like we get hydrocarbons. We get fossil fuels. We understand that. A fossil fuel plant is mighty simple. Anywhere I can get you a supply line, I can build you a throttleable plant that will cost in the range of tens of millions of dollars and receive a return on investment within 10 years, and it will work. It will work whether it's sunny or cold or whatever.
Right.
And it will always produce electricity. It will produce carbon dioxide while it does that. And you don't have an unlimited amount of hydrocarbons to feed it, but as long as that supply line is fed, that will produce electricity. It's very straightforward. And the amount of storage you get for free from hydrocarbons is immense. I forget the exact figure, but like a ton of coal is like 60,000 or 6,500 kilowatt hours of storage, I believe, in a ton of coal. And we have billions of tons of coal. Like, I'm just picking on coal because it's the worst hydrocarbon. It's the bulkiest. It's not a liquid. It's easier to transfer liquids. It's just a ton of stuff with coal that makes it undesirable among other available hydrocarbons. But even as, by virtue of it being a hydrocarbon, look at the grid. The energy grid consumes X number of terawatt hours or terawatts per second. That's the output of the grid. Mm-hmm. The biggest battery factory in the world is the gigawatt factory because it produces like a few gigawatt hours of energy storage per year. Mm-hmm. You would probably need like 50 or 100, I've done the math on it before. It's like 50 of those for a year. All of the energy storage to store the grid's needs for one day. 50 gigawatt factories operating for a year. Total output stores 1 day of grid storage. Or it might not be 1 day. It might be like a few incidentally, but it's on that scale. And that's not sufficient for grid storage. You need big buffers for grid storage.
Right.
Okay, let's go back to coal. Just the coal that we have laying around in stock, ready to go. We have something like 87 days worth of grid power in tappable energy that you can get from coal. I don't worry about it. That's unfortunate. You and your cleanliness. But by the way, that object, not using a lithium-ion battery, it's using using hydrocarbons.
Yes.
Because he has to do that all day. So he has to use the gas-powered thing. He's not going to be swapping out batteries all the time.
Right.
People beat up on hydrocarbons unrelentingly because they're trained to, because we got brought up on Captain Planet and stuff. And there's also a level of arrogance in that just rubs me the wrong way. Like, previous generations didn't know what a battery was, and previous generations didn't know the virtue of these hydrocarbons. Mm-hmm. Oh, they most certainly did. Some of the best batteries, iron flow batteries, were made hundreds of years ago, and they still work today. Mm-hmm. Tesla's batteries are doing fairly well. Not yes. Tesla the company, Tesla the guy.
Right.
These weren't idiot people. Hydrocarbons are scalable. They're logistically feasible. The byproduct of them is largely CO2. With coal, there can be a lot of other byproducts. Fly ash. Now, the byproducts, the material byproducts of combustion can be a blessing or a curse. Oil products give us all plastics. That's both a blessing and a curse. Mm-hmm. We can engineer them responsibly, or we can engineer them the way we do, where they don't break down. So you get a materials benefit from using hydrocarbons, right? You get plastics from oil. You get fly ash, which is a pitch for concrete from coal. Other types of gas like whatchamacallit, you can get radioactive elements and stuff like that, radons and whatnot, from other types of combustion. But there are downstream material bulk benefits from using these things that there are none with renewables. That's kind of the point. So renewable just has nature spin the turbine for you or do the electric circuit for you. The other thing, okay, so CO2 and then environmentalism. And I'm probably going to talk about like everything that I think about in this 5 hour. I'm going to run out of every stance or possibility on stuff. But are you really interested in this, or is it okay?
Keep going.
So CO2 and environmentalism, and the disconnect of culture. Like, I'm not saying you can't use renewables. You certainly can. It probably is tenable if Musk is a mighty smart dude. He probably knows how to scale batteries and how to go through phases of this.
Right.
He's not an idiot. He's not doing it for no reason. And ultimately, lithium ion, like people say that this is going back to what I was saying about how much of a facepalm it was when people were hype about the battery day. Like I increased its area by 50% and I got 50% more yield. Yeah, of course. People erroneously say that lithium ion is exponentially improving. The physical chemistry of lithium ion is not. That is a known chemistry. It works off of available surface energy. There might be a little bit of improvement you can squeeze out of it. But largely what they're talking about is the cost per lithium ion battery. And that should go down, right? And it's good that it's going down. And using lithium ion as a grid storage approach is a very suboptimal idea. The point of a lithium ion battery, or lithium anything, lithium polymer too, is that among the batteries, it's the most energy dense. So you put them in portable stuff like phones and cars, right? If you're going to do grid storage, use iron flow. Use some other chemistry that's bulkier but cheaper and can store more energy for less money. And if you want to be hype and really excited about the falling cost of energy storage for batteries, you should not be looking at lithium ion. You're forcing the technology to do something it doesn't want to.
Right,
Incidentally, Musk is making electric cars, which is one of the applications for lithium ion, because again, if you're going to make a battery, you're going to have to use the most energy dense battery you have available to you, which is lithium. And that's why he's making them. Now, he might one day scale them to some ridiculous scale to where they might incidentally do grid storage as well, because they're just at a larger scale than a better, more suitable technology that never did get scaled for it. He might do that. It might go that way. It would be stupid, but hey, I mean, like, we get stuck with a QWERTY keyboard so that the arms don't jam, right? That's why QWERTY had its layout, was that it was designed to be slow so that people didn't jam the arms of the typewriter. And thank God we're stuck with it forever. We could get that way with lithium ion for sure. It's not an optimal way to do grid storage with batteries. Optimal way, or the best we have for portable devices, yes. Grid storage, no. Should renewables be used as grid replacement? No, they're not tenable to use as grid replacements. You will have to go through a lot of cost and pain in order to get renewables to work. There are no downstream materials benefits. You don't get a plastics industry. You do not get a concrete industry. You do not get auxiliary stuff dealing with the bulk materials that because there are none for renewables. And while they do, in some cases, make excellent supplements to the grid, you can save a lot of the materials that you'll have to go through by supplementing with renewables, and they should be done that way. They are not as clean for the environment as we would like to, as we're trained to believe. It takes an awful lot of land to utilize photovoltaics, because photovoltaics aren't really super energy dense, so it takes a lot of land to clear to use them. In areas like deserts where there's sun and land, good on you. But that's not where most of us live. We don't like to live in deserts. We like to live on coastlines. So land is one for photovoltaics. Just the production into photovoltaics. Again, they all have storage issues. Wind, also land. Also, there's a little bit of stuff with birds, but that's mostly propaganda by oil companies being sour that wind turbines are perceived as like the new pump jack. It's just like a cultural thing. It's like the wind turbine is not disrupting you, Exxon. So stop being sour about it. I wish Exxon had better strategists. They probably actually do have really good strategists. They just don't have any PR. They're all quiet. The main thing that critiques fossil fuels, there are two critiques. One, we're running out, and two, CO2 is ruining the world.
Right.
Like with everything, those are both actually nuanced points. One, we're running out. Technically, not really. We're running out of available hydrocarbons that are easily tapped. And we might not actually be really running out of them. So this goes into the nature of hydrocarbons on Earth. So petroleum, the mineral in the ground, the oil that we drill up. Our current theory of fossil fuels is that fossil fuels. It was previously life. It gets compressed, and then it goes into deposits. We tap those deposits, and we get basically dinosaur squeezings out. Dinosaur squeezings is unfair. It's really mostly like plankton squeezings. Bituminous coal is usually forests, old ancient forests or seabed. It's not seabeds. Seabeds usually make oil, but if I'm remembering correctly, I'm sure there's some environmental scientist or environmental geotechnical engineer that will correct me on the minutiae of that. But yes, there are for sure. We know because we could pick up fossils in coal that yes, this was once alive. This is how it was. We know that that's the case. However, in the West, we discount the idea of abiotic oil or abiotic fuels. We write that off as myth, and that's not fair because it's obviously clear, abundantly and clearly and obviously clear that absolutely planetary chemistry makes hydrocarbons all on its own. We know through radio spectroscopy by observing nebula clouds that there's even complicated alcohols out there. We know that there's methane on Titan. Do you think there's methane without there being methanol, without there being other hydrocarbons? No, there's other hydrocarbons out there. Probably not because there was an ancient fish deposit there. It was probably because of planetary chemistry. So, of course, Earth's mantle produces hydrocarbons. The bulk of the hydrocarbons are not easily tappable. You cannot get an energy return on the energy investment for a big well of oil that's like 30 million miles down. I don't know about 30 million. It would be a couple thousand. But you can't get a return on investment. You can't use that. But it does have an effect. So if the majority of the carbon that's on the surface of the Earth comes from vulcanization, the flow of the mantle, and the fact that oil is lighter than water, right? Typically, if it gets compressed by oil is a little bit more compressible than there's some stuff, but if the carbons are if carbon does come from the Earth itself and not recirculated from life, then and this is what kind of scares me ecologically. You have basically a flow of there's a flow of Earth's surface, here's the crust, and mantle chemistry has convective flows, and tiny little bit of that is percolated up here to the surface of the Earth. And then there's also a carbon cycle on Earth's atmosphere. And there's actually a little bit of a carbon sink as well. So this is not guaranteed to be an equilibrium system. This can be a net carbon gain to the atmosphere or a net carbon loss to the atmosphere. We've been through both. Many times before, there's cycles. We go through interglacial cycles on the scale of about 10,000 years or so. What we're doing as humans is we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere than nature normally would. Whether that's a good or bad thing is very relative. Certain organisms do well under high carbon environments. We're at 400 and change parts per million CO2. We have seen it go up from 380, something like that. No, it was lower. It was lower than 380. But we've seen like a 80 parts per million increase in about less than 100 years, which is a pretty steep climb. It's the steepest climb that we have in high resolution because we've just been observing back then. And the resolution of past events, particularly past catastrophic events, does not get preserved very well. It would be foolish to believe that it'd be foolish to believe that global history or ecological history hasn't gone through traumatizing events. We know about asteroid impacts, but we also know that there's other things that are traumatic. Where in an afternoon, the entire game changes. We are putting more carbon in the atmosphere. We're not sinking it. It's a net carbon gain. The amount of carbon that we have available to us as humans to use as hydrocarbons since what we are mining is stuff that came out of the carbon cycle, the life carbon cycle
Right.
in the atmosphere, and we're not really mining any more of it from the mantle because you can't make a return on energy invested that way. We're not adding carbon into the atmosphere or into Earth that it hasn't seen before. So while we're putting more into the biosphere temporarily, what's really dominating the cycle is how much carbon comes out of the mantle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're not changing that. We can't change that. Well, we probably could, but we would have to lose energy in order to do that. This biosphere thing, this is pretty resilient to change,
Mm-hmm.
and this is nothing new for it. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, we're taking carbon that used to be life and we're putting it back into the biosphere. Hey, that's not particularly systemically problematic. Like, we're not going to turn into Venus because of that. Some people say that you're going to turn into Venus for it. One, that violates enthalpy, not entropy, enthalpy. Mm-hmm. You can't have a chemical configuration that you do not have the energy to support. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. We're not close enough to the sun for that to. Anywho. Relative to our size or our available cross-sectional surface area, we're not close enough to the sun to be a Venus. We would need a lot more stuff. What would change? What could change that is the rate at which the Earth bleeds out hydrocarbons, and not just hydrocarbons, but carbons in general. So if there were some kind of geological events that took large amounts of hydrocarbon from the mantle and put into the biosphere. Mm-hmm. That's stuff that we won't do because we can't get energy for free, but that's nature essentially taking thermal energy that has stored in its core and bleeding out a good bit of energy, and along the way, by the way, it just really changed the composition of our atmosphere. So no, I don't see us as doing anything that can like turn us into Venus, so that should be
Right.
discounted. That's silly. It's an interesting thought and interesting to reflect on, but it's not true. The other thing about like environmental alarmism, and I'm very pro like geoengineering. Like a lot of these things that we do, I take deep concern with. Mostly plastics. Ocean plastics are probably the worst thing that we do. Mm-hmm. We have no idea what microplastics do on the tissue level, let alone like these monomers that are going to be around to cellular life.
We don't know what it does, except that microplastics are pervasive now.
Yeah.
You can't get fish without getting a certain amount of microplastics, unless they're farm fish.
Yeah. Even the farm fish, what are they going to be held in? Most likely a polyurethane tank. Maybe not polyurethane. It's HTP, high density polyethylene. If it's a like IBC tote, it's a high density polyethylene. Other than that, it's like I'm visualizing the plastic, but I can't. It's PVC polyvinyl chloride. Yeah, sorry. Sometimes the words don't line up with the thought.
It gets worse as you get older.
Oh man, thanks. Thanks. Maybe it's microplastics in my brain tissue that's preventing my neurons from firing. Microplastics scare the heck out of me. Invasive species disruption scares me. Mm-hmm. There are environmental scars on this planet that go ignored. The Aral Sea, the devastation of the Aral Sea is probably the worst ecological disaster. Mm-hmm. The Great American Chestnut died to Asian canker virus. Billions of trees. That fundamentally changes the biological carrying capacity of the eastern United States. It's gone. There have been engineering efforts, by the way, to engineer genetically resistant chestnuts, and they need to be reintroduced. Mm-hmm. The California redwoods are dying off because we cut them down and make flooring out of them. they need to be moved. The climate is changing. It, by the way, it always changes. I'm going to make an argument about, or well, not an argument. I'm just going to point things out about it in a little bit. But it's changing at a rate that the California redwood cannot reasonably be expected to be able to migrate.
Right.
So those organisms need to be manually moved by us if they're going to survive other thousands of years. And that's a species that I think Earth is a lot cooler because it has California redwoods and sequoias and giant trees in them. So I'm very concerned with tangible environmentalism that I'm about to throw tangible environmentalism that I can pick up and touch. You know, probably another guest I'm going to have on here soon is Holly Sellers. She's an animal rehabilitator. Like I bring her turtles and stuff. I'm the kind of guy who picks up a turtle off the road. So that said, do I think, well, not do I think, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and climate change. The formula for climate change is really simple. It's natural variability plus man-made inputs equals change in climate. Natural variability is a wild swinging, it is not a stable thing on the scale of tens of thousands of years. Sometimes it changes in an afternoon. There are catastrophes that happen that nature will throw at it. Hey, here's a boloid impact. Deal with it.
Here's a volcano.
Yeah, there's a volcano. It's not going to stop. It's a basalt flow. I hope you like billions of tons of hydrocarbons, methanes, all kinds of stuff just daily for thousands of years. Yeah, right. Like basalt flows can really screw us up. Like that can make us Venus, right? Like if the mantle decides to do something crazy, then we can't do anything about it. But yeah, so I'm of the opinion that the man-made inputs are less than we expect. We live in a very clement period of geological history. We expect that we expect that of the total climate change, about this much is us, and this much is nature. Okay. If this is from CO2, I don't think it's like that. And this is just a baseless assumption, just by gut feeling. I think it's more like this. Between us burning hydrocarbons and the sun, I'm going to place my bets on the sun. Okay, there's this tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of energy exchange that goes around on the surface of Earth. A little bit of it's nuclear, most of it's hydrocarbon. A lot of that's monkey stuff. Most of that tiny little fraction is. The vast majority of it's the sun. The sun goes through her mood changes too.
Yes,
like
it does.
Solar weather is what drives climate on Earth. This should not be controvertible. I'm of the opinion that the vast majority of climate change is just natural variability. And there's a small portion of it that we are responsible for. And if we look at our impact and we say, hey, look, we're going to start mitigating our carbon emissions. Now, if you believe in this view, where it's like mostly us, and you say we're going to cut our carbon emissions like wherever, and that's our strategy to make sure that our species can deal with climate change, then that kind of makes sense, because this might be you might be able to mitigate this. You might be able to mitigate that. But if we're really down here and you come at me with we're gonna cut carbon emissions, you ain't going nowhere, pal. That's not going to change anything with climate change. Your strategy is going to lose. And here's the thing about global climate change is that it's probably this. I think I'm probably right about that. Natural variability will screw you. And when you have 7 billion people on this planet, the logistical costs to our species continuing to adapt to climate change, there's going to be some bumps along that road. Nature's driving it.
Major bumps.
Right. Massive immigration. Our arable land is going to shift drastically. Species will die off. New species will come around. It's going to happen. And if you come at me and say, I've got the solution to this, what we'll do is we'll hinder the economy and make the poor people even poorer by not giving them access to the hydrocarbons that we have been burning for the last 300 years. And I expect this to deal with climate change, and I expect that to win. I would say you're probably consigning yourself to a losing strategy out of ignorance.
Yeah.
So that's what I believe. I believe it's mostly nature, and we're trying to mitigate a tiny amount. And in fact, if our plan is to be able to adapt to nature as it changes, mitigating hydrocarbons is an afterthought. It is a thought, it's a consideration, but it's not what wins this game. What wins this game is diversity and continuing to exploit our environment in ways that are, exploit sounds so nasty, but that's how we survive. Continue to do so in wiser ways, and we should care about the environment in ways that are tangible, that you can touch. You should be able to repair the RLC, and you should be interested in geoengineering and reclaiming desert land to make it more biodiverse. These are things we can do.
Israel has done that.
Yes, they have.
Have you ever
with great
seen
success.
a map, a satellite image of Israel? Israel comes down to a point. It's all green. Everything on the other side of the border is desert.
Well, because they don't invest in engineering projects.
I mean, the Negev is green.
That my Israeli consultant, he's now moving to Turkey, but he pointed that out to me. Oh yeah, and since I have been here, we have reclaimed desert. Of course it can be done. They don't ask us. I don't know why. But yeah, so I am in favor of us being as good of stewards of our environment as possible. And things are not cut and dry binary. It's not like you emit carbon dioxide. That is for sure always a bad thing for everything. There are pros and cons, drawbacks, and benefits. And I believe that just by scale of our civilization being at 7 billion people strong more, you could make carbon emissions go to zero. I don't care what it is. There's no environmental impact at all. Like we stop breathing, right? Nature's still going to have enough variation to where there's going to be substantial costs with keeping 7 billion people in areas like coastlines change naturally. This is not. They did so in the Roman times. Like Romans lost ports and bays because of sea level change. Was it because the Romans were burning massive amounts of hydrocarbons? No, it wasn't. Maybe from the horses. It could be those darn horses burping up CO2 and methane. But I don't see it from a practical standpoint. Now, of course, I'm a heretic. So if I ever have a name for this podcast, it'll be the Heretic Podcast. Because that's like, to me, that's the best thing. Like heresy and blasphemy, speaking truth to power, that's my favorite thing to do. I don't like... I don't like being told what to say or what to think, and I'll speak my mind.
I don't know. The science that I've read points to human activity. Points to
Okay, this guy.
that guy.
Okay.
Now, there have been many ice ages. There have been all kinds of things that support this as well.
We're in an interglacial warming period now.
A very long one, as a matter of fact.
Ours is less hot than the ones before, we think. We're extrapolating off of ice cores. Less hot than the ones
That's
before.
right.
And it is a little bit plateaued. We think. We can't really tell. The closer you get to the present, the higher the resolution goes up, but the more noise you capture in that resolution. We have this with species extinction, right? People say, there's an alarming amount of, it's a great extinction going on. Well, no, that's because we're aware of how many, we're hyper aware of the diversity of species that live today. But of those species, it's going to be like the 20-80 rule. 80% of those species are going to be 20% of the total organisms. They're not going to make it in the fossil record. The vast majority of species that ever lived, you'll never even know about. We don't know what we don't know. So when we see one go, which, by the way, is almost always going to be some very niche species. Like, there was one of them, it was in St. Louis. It was like, it was some type of bird. And they classified birds on one side of the river as one species, and the same birds on the other side of the species, birds as the other one.
Yeah.
So it's like you get an extinction, but it's really just a population migrating. Like, it gets recorded as an extinction, though. So there's this fudging of the numbers to preach at people like the scientism, like, oh, look, things are going extinct. The same birds, like individual birds, live on the other side of the river now. It's not an extinction event. So, look, there might be more extinctions going on because that's than normal. That could be the case too. I don't believe it is. I think it'd be foolish to assume that not everything that makes sense is always right.
That's correct.
That's true, right?
That. Yeah.
I try to be the guy who makes the most sense, but I'm by no means always correct. So it could be that we're living in these extraordinary times, and this one time is like very novel amongst not just our generational history, our written history, but our geological history, and in fact, we're the center of the world. However, in every case of assuming you're the center of the world, I have never seen a single case of that ever be right. So I don't trust any of those notions that to an extreme point. Like, I don't trust that this is the first time that human civilization has been technologically sophisticated. I don't trust it. There's probably times where civilization has started and reset and so on and so forth, multiple times before. We wouldn't be able to tell. There's nothing to preserve that information really well, or at least in high enough resolution to where we can really tell what was going on with any particular accuracy. But a good thought exercise is if you imagine like snapping your fingers like a Thanos snap, and then you wait 1,000 years, there'd be nothing to tell of our civilization. There would be. Burial vaults will be able to be discovered tens of thousands of years after we're gone. And future anthropologists will look back on our civilization as the mysterious ground box people of North America. We believe they were most likely hunter-gatherers who, for religious reasons, made ground boxes which they buried their dead in. Other than that, man, scale of thousands of years?
There'll be a lot.
Mount Rushmore? No. It'll get ground to death by a...
Plastics will still be here. Space junk will still be there.
Space... Okay. So the way these things break down, yes, you're right. There will be traces of those things there. That if you were particularly... If you knew they were already there and they did happen, you would be able to find the traces to support your argument. Mm-hmm. But space junk will be an ever decreasing amount of space junk out there. So there will be a few less and less chunks of it, and it will be more dispersed. And the other evidence will become compressed with time. Time is not recorded in a linear fashion; it's recorded in a logistics curve fashion. You know, you go back 100 years, and you go back 1,000 years, and you go back 1,000,000 years. It gets compressed as time goes on. Yes, you'll be able to find plastics, just like we're able to find trinitite, where asteroid impacts have happened, because we know to look for trinitite because we've made it in Trinity when we ignited the first bombs, only because we knew to look. But other than that, it's just sand, right? And that's how it's going to be. You might be able to find plastic monomers, polyethylene you might be able to find, because as a monomer, well, ethylene.
How long does it take to break down?
Ethylene does not.
Yes.
That we know of. It's not the first time nature's dealt with that, but by the way, the lignum. Tree bark, when it evolved to lignum, there were no organisms around to deal with dead tree carcasses. Mm-hmm. You could not metabolize or break down lignum. This is where we get most of our anthracitic coal. From that geological time period. So we don't... Have
you ever seen the series After Earth or After Humans? After Humans.
I might have heard of it.
And it talks about just these things, how long it will take for our cities to crumble, and so on and so on.
Not very long.
Not very long at all.
Especially when you have a glacier that's 1.5 miles high, just kind of plow through it, erase all that. The Egyptians were very smart to put the pyramids where they did. That's very close to the equator, done with the right aspect ratios. That will last through time. Manhattan will not.
Manhattan will not, right.
No. The Mount Rushmore will last until a glacier plows it over. And then other than that, we'll be the burial vault people. We'll be the mysterious ground box people who are most likely hunter-gatherers. Future anthropologists will say that of us. Yeah, they were hunter-gatherers for sure. Why not? Glass material, any material that has a glass molecular structure is not fully a solid. We perceive it as a solid on our scale of time. Mm-hmm. It's a liquid. Those molecular chains will slide past each other given enough time.
Yeah.
Pitch, bitumen, will do this. We've seen just recently, a couple years ago, we saw a famous pitch drop experiment. It takes hundreds of years to do this experiment, where they have the pitch that they used to waterproof boats with back in the day, the age of sail.
Right.
If you have a block of pitch and you have a hole on the bottom of it, over 100 years, the block, the solid cube, will actually drop through the hole, form a teardrop, and drop. And our species has performed this experiment twice. Once the drop happened, and the camera had a glitch that day, and we didn't record it. And then the second time we got it, I believe it was done in Australia.
Okay.
Hundreds of years to do that experiment. So on time scales, things change.
Everything changes.
Yes.
On all time scales.
I think it's just scale in general. I think of scale.
Time is how we perceive change. There's nothing in the universe that does not change.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think fundamental constants probably change. Speed of light might drift. That's hard to think of. We would have no concept, no ability to prove that. We'd only have conceptualizations. We measured the speed of light and so far, and it was this. But imagine if those constants drifted, changed, shifted.
You're talking about something different. Speed of light as a concept may or may not change. The traveling of a photon changes position.
Yes.
And that's what I was referring to.
Right. I was thinking that the concept of the speed of light, that might also abstractly change.
It may.
Yeah.
It may.
It may or may not.
I don't know. I've never seen it.
You know an interesting thing about measuring the speed of light? It cannot be done one way. There's no way to measure the speed of light from point A to point B. You can only measure the two-way speed of light from point A to point B and back to point A. It's the only way to do it. You run into hard relativity problems.
Now, what about Bell's theorem? Does that contradict the speed of light?
I do not know Bell's theorem.
Bell's theorem has to do with the fact that when you split a proton or an electron,
Mm-hmm.
I'm losing my voice. You split an electron. I brought my candy.
Okay.
Because it coats my throat,
I
actually.
get you.
When you split an electron and it goes this way and this way, they can be infinitely separated. A change made to this electron causes an identical change to the other electron.
Quantum entanglement.
Entanglement. That's exactly what Bell's theorem talks about, except that they're mirror images. If this one turns right, this one turns left.
I don't have the expertise to say why you can't transfer information that way, but I just remember being utterly convinced through a very tight argument by someone smarter than me that you cannot transfer information through quantum entanglement. That might not be true. I would not have the ability to verify or not. I could just look at other people's arguments and go, wow, that's all I could do.
I've read about it.
Mm-hmm.
I am not an expert in it.
I don't know.
But that's the only thing that I can think of that I've read about that maybe, if it holds, that may be faster than the speed of light.
There's another thing that I think of as a practical way to, in practice, have something that's faster than the speed of light.
Uh-huh.
The speed of light is a relativistic propagation, right? How fast can stuff propagate through this system of interactivity, the universe, as you mentioned. And you can liken that sort of to like if I have a body of water, there's a speed of sound within the water.
Yeah.
And same with air. And that's the speed at which a signal or something propagates through it.
Right.
Because it's made of these particles that have a certain density, so on and so forth.
Right.
So, in effect, nothing effectually propagates through that faster than its propagation speed, right? But just like in the speed of water or the speed of sound in water, you can have things that break the sound barrier, and you can in fact have stuff that don't break the sound barrier but still travels faster than the propagation speed.
Mm-hmm.
If I take a stone and I skip the stone across the top of the water, the amount of energy that it has on the impact with the interface of the water is such that it prefers to rebound
Mm-hmm.
and then perhaps skip several more times. And that skipping motion outruns the propagation speed. It has to.
My candy.
Oh, so similarly.
Do you want one?
No, but thank you. I'll stick with the water. Similarly, I think you can have a highly energetic event that has to interface with space-time from an external dimension, right? Because XYZ, the body of water.
Yeah.
And as it interfaces with that dimension, the energetic event will skip. It'll pop in and out of existence as we see it, and further on down the line. The extra-dimensional thing doesn't care about your speed of light to begin with, but we can see the effects of things violating the speed of light because they're interdimensional, or they're extra-dimensional, I should say. Speaking of dimensions, a dimension that people do not recognize as a dimension, which I will say right here on this podcast, which perhaps dozens of people may listen to. I will say that scale itself should be considered to be another dimensional axis. I think of X, Y, Z, T, and S, possibly W,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how many axes there are in order to render something. The word rendering, that is a fascinating topic. Just the idea of taking something metaphysical and then manifesting it into something physical or another system.
Mm-hmm. That
word rendering is very, very helpful in describing a lot of phenomena that we see. We ended up using it mostly with computer engineering, rendering software instructions into hardware instructions and into outputs. But it's very helpful. It's likely the reason why we see a fundamental disconnect between general relativity and quantum physics is because quantum physics as we know it, is likely a rendering algorithm of metaphysical instructions. Physics is likely metaphysical. It's likely software. Like if I think I stole this from a TED Talk, but it affected me no less. If I take a magnifying glass and I turn on my screen and I look at it and I go, aha, pixels, that's what this is.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the output. That tells you nothing about the software, right? Nothing about the instruction set.
Right.
And if we apply that reasoning to an analogy between the two areas of physics that we observe, we find that, that makes sense that there's going to be a disconnect between quantum physics and general relativity.
Mm-hmm.
They obey totally different instruction sets, though they interface somewhat, right? There's interface points. So finding those very narrow and very well hidden interface points
Mm-hmm.
is, unsurprisingly, a very understandably difficult thing for physicists to have to find. They really don't even know they're looking for an interface point. They would
String theory, superstring theory, claims to have solved that problem.
interface points between.
Read the books of, well, you don't read, Brian Greene.
I Elegant Universe. I listen. I don't like reading. It's just a format.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I believe his latest is The End of Time. The end.
Since when did he get into the political spectrum?
The End of Time. It doesn't sound right, but it's something like that. In any case, it's much more philosophical than his earlier books.
So he started political commentary.
No political commentary. Philosophical.
The title, like The End of Time, I was like, aha, I see what
They're
you're saying.
talking about the end of the universe and what's going to happen to us as a species, and
Deep Time?
deep, very, very.
That's one of my fascinations. I don't know if Brian Greene talked about Maxwell's demons as Boltzmann events. But Deep Time gets really weird. Yeah. Anyway, it has been it's been over 3 hours, almost 4.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. Time flies. Now watch me see.
Much longer than last week.
Okay. I believe that should be the end.